totally wrong facts that people still believe. The flat earth fallacy. Okay, we all know that the earth is flat, right? I'm obviously joking, and I'll save the tinfoil hat for another day. But what I'm referring to isn't flat earthers in the modern day, but it's the flat earth belief that was held by people in the Middle Ages, specifically around the time when Christopher Columbus took his infamous journey across the ocean. Obviously, during the Middle Ages, it was believed that the earth was flat and that if you were to sail too far in the wrong way in the ocean, you could literally fall off the earth. And it was for this reason that Christopher Columbus wanted to prove these people wrong and risked his life sailing the opposite way to India to prove that the earth was round and not flat, going against the primary belief at that time. Now, what if I told you that everything you just heard about that situation is not true whatsoever? It is actually a rather popular misconception. Let me explain. While Christopher Columbus did sail across the ocean to prove a point, the point he was not trying to prove was that the earth wasn't flat. The point he was trying to prove was that the earth wasn't as big as some people suspected. It is historical fact that not only Christopher Columbus, but basically any educated individual during the 1400s knew that the earth wasn't flat and was in fact round. And this knowledge dates back far before Christopher Columbus or even the Middle Ages entirely. Some of the first recorded suggestions that the earth may be round actually date all the way back to the 6th century BC with the Greek philosopher Pythagoras. And later in the 4th century BC, Aristotle even agreed and supported this theory, citing one personal observation that he noticed every time he traveled southward, southern constellations would be higher in the sky. But this, of course, wasn't the only evidence we had of the Earth being round. During this time, we also had recorded observations of lunar eclipses showing a round shadow on the moon from Earth, and of course, numerous eyewitness accounts of mountains seemingly growing out of the ground on the horizon as you approach them, or seeing a ship seemingly submerge into the water as it sails into the ocean. My point is that we've had a lot of evidence that the Earth is round, and it dates back far, like way before the Middle Ages and even way before the Common Era. But just to further validate this point, in the 3rd century BC, it wasn't just a suggestion that the Earth may be round. At this point, it was basically a known fact to anybody in the educated community. And philosophers and scientists were not so much focused on the shape of the Earth, but the size of the Earth. And potentially, most impressively, at this time, the head librarian of the Library of Alexandria, Eratosthenes, was able to estimate the circumference of the Earth with 99% accuracy. And while that estimate wasn't proven to be extremely accurate until much later, it still goes to show that there is a lot of evidence suggesting that not only was the world not flat very long ago, but that people were well aware that the Earth was not flat. Which brings us back to our original point. No, Christopher Columbus did not think that he was potentially going to fall off the world, and nobody who was educated or even slightly paying attention thought that either. And while seemingly flat earthers have existed in every era of history, they're as ridiculous today as they were back in 1492. What was the point of this entire expedition? Well, like I mentioned earlier, Columbus didn't believe the mainstream theory of how big the Earth was. And his goal, with the support from Queen Elizabeth, was not to prove that the Earth was round or not to see what was beyond the edge of the Earth, but to potentially find a more quick and efficient trade route between Europe and Asia to optimize international trade. And of course, we all know what happened from there on out, and well, here we are. So yeah, the suggestions from people in the Middle Ages believing the Earth was flat are actually modern misinformation, with this myth being brought to the mainstream in the 1700s and 1800s. And unfortunately today, stick figures on the internet still need to undo all of this misinformation. But in case you wanted a real misconception that was believed during the Middle Ages, I'll give you one. A lot of people during this time suspected that the sun rotated around the Earth. That was until Nicholas Copernicus came around and suggested that maybe the Earth rotated around our sun. And he did so not with observable evidence, but with a mathematical model that was not only hard to argue, but was eventually proven true. The Mount Everest myth. If learning that the Earth is actually round blew your mind, then this is about to shatter it. Everybody and their grandmother's grandmother knows that Mount Everest is by far the tallest mountain in the entire world. But what if I told you that actually wasn't the case? Now, before you think I'm lying, let me just confirm that yes, Mount Everest has the highest peak above sea level in the entire world. The peak of Mount Everest is 29,029 feet above sea level, and it is confirmed the tallest peak around the globe. But what if I told you that there was another mountain that was technically taller? If you're confused, don't worry, because I'm about to make it all make sense. Introducing Mauna Kea, a dormant volcano on the island of Hawaii. Looking at this mountain, it's relatively impressive, but only stands at roughly 13,800 feet above sea level, meaning that it's tall, but it's obviously not taller than Mount Everest. That is, unless you measured from base to peak. And this is where this technicality comes into play, because Mauna Kea is kind of like an iceberg, and there's a lot more than meets the eye. Specifically, the 20,000 feet of mountain that exists under the ocean. ocean. That's right, unlike Mount Everest, the base of Mauna Kea is submerged deep underwater. And it's for that reason that while from base to tip it is technically 4,000 feet taller than Mount Everest, due to the fact that most of it is actually underwater, it will unfortunately never claim the title of tallest mountain simply because it has a pretty significant disadvantage of existing in an ocean. It's almost like you were 6'5" and you went to a tall guy competition. But in order to compete, you had to stand in a 5-inch hole, meaning that you were only 6 foot. And while the person you were competing was standing on flat ground and was only 6'1" tall, well, guess what? This other guy is technically taller than you, even if you have a few inches underground. But I have a feeling this one might be a bit controversial, so let me know what you think. Does anything below sea level not count, even if it is part of the mountain's base? Or is Mauna Kea an underdog that deserves more attention? Because realistically, base to tip, it is the tallest mountain in the entire world. I'll let you guys duke it out in the comments, but if you ever want to be the most annoying person in the world, next time you hear somebody claim that Mount Everest is the tallest mountain in the world, make sure to confidently and rudely tell them, no, actually, Mount Everest has the tallest peak in the world, but Mauna Kea is the tallest base to tip. And in case that doesn't kill the mood at the party, well, then just tell them how much you hate pineapple on pizza, because those people are annoying too. The hot-headed hoax. One experience I had when I was younger that I think we all share is the experience of being a kid and not wanting to wear a coat. There was just so many times where it was cold out, but I didn't want to wear a coat. I had no logical explanation, I just didn't feel like wearing that restrictive device. But every single time, Mama Bro made me wear my coat and we went about our day. But it wasn't always a coat I was apprehensive to wear. Sometimes it was hats and gloves. Which brings me to the myth at play. My mom used to tell me that you have to wear a hat when it's cold out because 80% of the heat from your body leaves through your head. And for that reason, you need to insulate it to ensure you are fully warm. And I know for a fact my mom wasn't the only person to say that. And if I was a betting man, I would say that your mom probably did too. But whether it was a family member or a loved one or a friend or even just a news article, the reality is this. Your head is not some elusive chimney that is dead set on lowering your body's core temperature. But before we use facts to completely debunk this myth, let's actually trace back the origins of it. And it's not that long ago. The most commonly accepted origin of this myth dates back to the 1970s in a US Army survival manual, where in that survival manual it claims that covering your head is a necessity in the cold because, quote, 40 to 45% of body heat is lost from the head. And while you think a US Army survival manual would be a relatively reputable source for this sort of information, this is one thing they got wrong. But at this point you might be asking yourself, where did they even get this number or this theory? How did they come up with 40 to 45% of your body heat being lost through your head? And well, those roots date back to the 1950s, where the US military was doing tests on volunteers dressed in Arctic survival suits and were exposed to bitterly cold conditions. And the point of this test was to see where the body was losing most heat in these suits to better help optimize them. And during this flawed analysis, one thing that the scientists realized was that, most of the body heat in these volunteers is being lost through their head. But as you can see, these Arctic survival suits do not include hats, meaning that logically the head would lose the most heat, not because it is some crazy part of the body, it's just the fact that the head was not covered. And scientists who went back to analyze this data have even been recorded to say, quote, if the experiment had been performed with people only wearing swim trunks, then they would have lost no more than 10% of the heat through their heads. And it's almost hard to believe that such a simple seeming logical fallacy would exist in such a professional place, you know, a literal military survival test. But I suppose this one was overlooked because, yeah, if your entire body is insulated and only your head is exposed to the elements, your head definitely will lose the most amount of heat. Not because your head is vulnerable, but because the head was the only part that was literally exposed to the elements. So here's the facts. While it may seem logical that your head may be more vulnerable because of the lack of fat and the abundance of blood vessels, the reality is that heat escapes from all parts of the human body at a similar rate per square inch. And while in your own personal experience, it may seem like your head is the primary source of your heat loss in cold weather, as we saw in the military test, it's not necessarily because your head is extra vulnerable, it's because typically your head is the least insulated with clothing. So yeah, is it a good idea to wear a hat or a toque on a cold day? Definitely. But is it because your head loses much more heat than the rest of your body? No, your head is just more vulnerable because most people aren't wearing toques all the time. And even if you are wearing a toque, it's very unlikely that you're insulating your head like you're insulating your chest, because you could put on a coat and insulate your entire torso. But unless you're wearing a balaclava and ski goggles, your head is always going to be less insulated. Not biologically, but by choice. The cold conundrum. Okay, since we're already on the topic of cold weather and stuff your mom told you, I figured this would be the perfect follow-up. And the follow-up in question is the interesting fact that you can get sick from being exposed to the cold. Logically, it makes sense. It's called a cold, you get it from being cold. What else is there to question? That is logical fact. But what if I was to be so bold to suggest that it wasn't the cold weather that was directly causing flu season to affect people? And I know it may sound blasphemous to your grandmother, but going outside without a hat or with wet hair isn't going to cause you to catch pneumonia. So what's the real scoop? Well, for starters, it's proven that you can't get an infectious or viral disease simply from being exposed to cold temperatures. However, you can get hypothermia, but that's different. So why do seemingly so many people catch colds or the flu as soon as the seasons start to change? There has to be something to it. And the fact of the matter is, there is something to it, but it's a lot more than meets the eye. You see, just because you don't develop a flu upon first contact with a cool breeze doesn't mean that there's not factors at play that cause the typical flu season. And while temperatures getting cooler may be the most obvious and seemingly guilty culprit, it's really one of the least. And some of the more unlikely culprits are the following. Firstly, reduced vitamin D levels, because as winter approaches, people are spending less time outside, the sun is seen less in most parts of the world, and as a result, your vitamin D levels are below what they should be. On top of this, during cooler months, overall air humidity is lowered, and it has been proven that lower humidity can increase your risk of rhinoviruses. And thirdly, rhinoviruses are typically spread through direct person-to-person contact, or by inhaling small droplets in the air, which is gross. But these things can only take place when you're coming in contact with people, typically in an enclosed environment. And during colder months, we typically spend more time inside, meaning that there's more risk of exposure. And when you combine all three of these factors all happening at the same time, it's not really hard to understand how more people could be more susceptible to diseases at a certain time of year, regardless of the outside temperature. So to settle the debate once and for all, does direct cold exposure cause you to get sick? No. But does every aspect of winter covertly try to get you sick? I would say yes. Meaning that just because you're safe from a cold breeze doesn't mean you're safe from a cold. Bubblegum bewilderment. Okay, admittedly, this entry is a bit less serious, but I think it's definitely the most universal, and call it a playground fact if you will, because I believe that almost everybody watching this video either believed or at least heard of this next fact, which is that if you swallow chewing gum, it will stay in your stomach for 7 years. Or, some variation of that. And if you've ever heard this, well, I'm about to give you the full scoop. And if you still believe this, well, I'm about to blow your mind. Obviously, because I'm talking about this in this video, the gum does not stay in your body for 7 years. It actually stays in your digestive system for over 20 years. That is a joke. It does not at all. You see, it is true that gum is indigestible. Your body can simply not break it down and process it. But that does not mean that your body can't pass it through. And believe it or not, you probably eat a lot of things that your body can simply not digest. And if you don't believe me, well, two popular examples are corn and sunflower seeds. And don't even get me started on indigestible fibers. Keep in mind, your body is resilient. And just imagine all the stuff that our ancient stomachs had to deal with. And just think about all the things your body had to deal with when you were a kid. Swallowing Lego and eating Polly Pocket pieces. Or possibly even shoving those light bright things up your nose. Regardless, your body in one way or another is able to deal with pretty interesting situations. It is for that reason that gum in your digestive tract, at least on rare occasions, is not a concern. But it does in fact differ from standard digestion. Let me explain. In the context of normal food items, there is a 3-step process that every food must go through before it can be digested. First, your food must be, of course, chewed. And this chewing process not only breaks down food, but also increases its surface area, which is directly beneficial for the next step of the process, which is actually executed by your saliva. Your saliva covers these small pieces of food, and with its now increased surface area, your saliva's enzymes are able to break it down even further. And once the food is properly chewed and salivated, it is then sent to your stomach for the final stage of processing, where your stomach acid turns all of your food into a smooth mush that your digestive tract can easily pass through and absorb nutrients out of. And while this is the process for most foods, gum does not play by these rules at all. For starters, you can chew gum all day long, and the breakdown it's going to experience is minimal. And the vast majority of people will spit out their gum before it'll ever begin to break down into smaller pieces. But even if you did intentionally chew your gum into smaller pieces, it's not going to affect what happens in the next 2 stages. You see, chewing gum is made out of both natural and synthetic polymers. And it's for this reason that the gum cannot be broken down by either your saliva or your stomach acid. And that's honestly a good thing, because if your body was able to break down the polymers for your digestive tract to absorb it, you would get very sick. So be grateful it's kind of immune to those processes. But regardless, now that you have intact gum, not only in your stomach, but now in your digestive tract, what happens? Well, like any other food product, it'll slowly make its way through your digestive system, potentially getting caught up on the way, but eventually getting its way out, typically in 1 to 2 days. Although gum can be sticky, your body is designed to get rid of even the most stubborn of foods, and that includes chewing gum. But I will say this, even though chewing gum won't stay in your stomach for 7 years like you might have thought on the playground, it's not recommended that you start swallowing it en masse. And that's because if you do swallow enough chewing gum, you can develop something that's known as a bezoar, which is just essentially a blockage in your digestive tract, which can be painful, dangerous, and even deadly if left untreated. So no, chewing gum does not stay in your body for numerous years, although it's not recommended you try it for yourself. The chameleon con. I'm about to take you on an emotional roller coaster, but spoiler alert, it has a happy ending, so buckle up. We all know that chameleons can change color. That is their claim to fame, and I am not going to take that from them. That is an undisputed fact. But the thing that I will dispute is the fact that they do this for camouflage purposes. In almost every cartoon and TV chameleon we see, they are specifically changing their colors to blend into a specific environment. And while this is a neat party trick and a logical survival instinct, this is actually not what's going on in most cases. But before I describe exactly why chameleons actually change color, I want to describe exactly how they change color, because this process is amazing. You see, in the skin of a chameleon, it has what is known as pigment cells. Pigment cells aren't necessarily rare in the animal kingdom, and there are certain animals that can even control them, such as squids and cuttlefish. Those animals actually have small muscles that can expand or contract these pigment cells to change their color. However, that's not how the chameleon changes its colors. It has these pigment cells, but it can't control them. Now, interestingly, between these pigment cells, chameleons have separate cells that have darker melanin pigment, and these cells specifically can be controlled by the chameleon. And how this works is really quite astonishing. These melanin pigment cells basically expand or contract across the surface of the skin to either darken or lighten the skin of the chameleon. And this works completely separately from the default pigment cells that are already on the skin. Chameleons aren't the only animal that do this process either. There's a fish known as the tilapia fish that also has this same method of color changing. And you can see on this close-up video exactly how it works in real time, and it is so crazy. Seeing it side by side on a visual level and on a cellular level is so interesting. But we're still not done yet, because on top of the pigment cells that already exist and the melanin pigment cells that the chameleon can control, the chameleon also has tiny crystals in its skin that reflect light. And by seemingly some miracle, the chameleons can control exactly how far these crystals are from each other within its own skin. And the distance that these crystals are from each other directly determine the type of light that is reflected off the chameleon's skin. And now that we know the three primary tools in a chameleon's tool belt when it comes to changing color, how does this look in real time? Because I think most of us have a falsified idea of how this even looks. Here's a side-by-side video of a fake chameleon change and a real chameleon change. As you can see, the real is a little bit slower and a lot less dramatic, but still amazing nonetheless. But to go back to the original point of this section, if chameleons don't change their color for camouflage, why do they change their color at all? And sometimes fact is stranger than fiction, because chameleons are basically nature's mood ring. And scientists are pretty certain that in most cases, the only reason that chameleons are changing color are to better express their emotions to potential mates or to potential predators. And scientists even have their own theories on what each color means, which I'll go through right now. It's believed that when chameleons are extremely bright and colorful, they are at their most excited. And this could mean excited about a potential fight or excited about a potential mating session. I said mating session. When chameleons are typically darker, it's believed they are feeling more submissive or relaxed, for a less sensual word. But yeah, chameleons are cool, cute, cuddly. Some of them even have horns, but what you've been told about them is a lie. And it's believed that in the vast majority of cases, chameleons don't change color to blend in, they're changing color to better express themselves, which I think is an even cooler reality than what's portrayed in movies. But that's just my opinion. The subscriber scam. I think that one common fact most people believe is that if somebody's watching your video, they're probably subscribed to you. But I'm here to tell you that that fact is completely wrong. And I've got the facts to prove it. YouTube tells me that nearly 75% of people watching my videos are not even subscribed, which is a crazy statistic. So if you've been watching my videos and you enjoy them, feel free to hit the subscribe button. And if you need a reason to subscribe and you're not already, look at the subscribe button while I say, subscribe to Trust Me Bro. If that doesn't blow your mind, I don't know what will. But now let's get to our next serious section, the fortune cookie falsehood. Growing up, getting Chinese food was a special occasion, and it was truly one of my favorite special meals. And out of the entire seemingly endless spread that we would order from these Chinese food places, my favorite part of the meal was always the fortune cookie. Obviously a staple in Chinese cuisine, and a long-lasting tradition in Chinese culture, right? The fortune cookie, always served in Chinese restaurants, has to be Chinese. It would make no sense any other way, right? And while I agree with that hypothesis, I'm sorry to tell you, but that is not the truth. The fortune cookies that you and I get in modern day Chinese food have almost nothing to do with China whatsoever. And ironically, when the whole fortune cookie craze took over the Western world, companies tried selling fortune cookies in China, marketing them as an American treat, but they were taken off shelves because nobody was interested in them. And I genuinely don't think you can get more ironic than that. But if the paper in cookie tradition doesn't come from China and the cookie doesn't come from China, then who came up with these crazy cookies and why do they sell them at Chinese food spots? Well, I'm gonna answer both of those questions. But to be totally transparent, there is no definitive historical source of Chinese fortune cookies. All we have is some more modern accounts and some historical speculation, with the most proven and accepted theory being that Chinese fortune cookies actually originate in Japan, One of the only historical records of modern-day Chinese fortune cookies exist in illustrations from 19th century Japan, and these illustrations show a treat known as Sujiura Senbei. But these illustrations aren't just a relic from the past, because to this day you can buy this treat handmade on the streets of Kyoto. And how they make it is the following. Bakers will use iron molds, will grill the dough to a medium firm consistency, and then they will fold this dough into something they call small waffles. And it's during this folding process where they will insert a piece of paper with the fortune and give it its classic curved shape. But admittedly, this Japanese version and the Western version you and I are likely used to eating are not the same. With Sujiura Senbei, for example, they are larger, darker, and savory. Whereas in the American version, they are sweeter, smaller, and lighter in texture because they are using butter instead of miso in the baking process. But while that is interesting and insightful, it still doesn't answer the question, how did this get into Chinese restaurants in America? And well, the answer is immigration and adaptability. During the 1910s, a lot of Japanese immigrants were landing in California. And with them, they brought their culture, specifically Sujiura Senbei. And while that logically explains why these fortune cookies are in America, why are they in Chinese restaurants? And while this isn't definitively proven, the most commonly accepted answer as of now is a result of Asian fusion food restaurants and America's early on disdain for Japanese food. And what I mean by this is, in the 1910s, a lot of Japanese immigrants were struggling to open authentic Japanese restaurants, specifically because Americans were not too fond of eating raw fish. And because of this, these Japanese entrepreneurs decided that their best next steps were to create Chinese food restaurants, tailoring the dishes to the American palate, specifically giving a sweet treat at the end of a meal. Hence why the American fortune cookie is sweet and the Japanese version is, well, not. I saved this entry for the end of the video because technically it's not fact. There is a lot of working theories about all of the specific origins, and there is not one definitive historical account start to finish of the entire history of fortune cookies. However, what I've told you today is most commonly the accepted version of events. However, you could argue it's not fully known. And well, that's accurate. But I honestly just think the entire history of fortune cookies is just so interesting because it was a Japanese tradition that was brought to America, was extremely popular in America, was brought to China, and failed in China, which is, I don't know, ironic and worth mentioning. How humans had fun in every time period. If F is for friends who do stuff together, and U is for you and me, and N is for anywhere and any time at all, then it is implied that there has been fun throughout all of human history. But if that's the case, who was having this fun? And how is this fun being had? Bro Sauce, Brody here. In today's video, we are going to discuss exactly that, and discover how humans had fun in every time period. The Stone Age. The Stone Age is one of the most interesting and mysterious eras of human history. Mainly because while the Stone Age takes up 99.3% of all known human history, we know the least about it. And that's for one major reason. The Stone Age is prehistoric, meaning we have absolutely no records on what exactly was going on. And all of the modern day's best guesses about the Stone Age really come from ancient clues that were sealed in time, only recently dug up by modern archaeologists. And while we definitely don't know everything about our ancient ancestors, we've learned quite a bit, giving us at least enough context to make some educated guesses on what prehistoric humans were doing for fun. Let me set the scene. It was a hot day in the African savannah. You and your caveman buddies had just got back from a successful hunting trip. You give the elders in your tribe the kill, and you go to the local cave to rest. After cooling down for a few minutes, you realize it's that part of the day where you have nothing to do. During the morning, you had a successful hunt and gathered water. And now the gatherers are gathering, and the elders are preparing food, and the females in the tribe are tending to the children. As a Stone Age man, in the middle of the day, you've got some free time on your hand. And it's what you do with those hands that determines the type of man you are. And no, I'm not talking about that. You and your cave wife already unga-bunga today. What I do mean is that for some prehistoric humans, sitting around and lounging was enough. And that's because prehistoric life was hard, and simply surviving was a full-time job. Between following the migration patterns of animals, building temporary shelters, hunting food, surviving animal attacks, surviving disease, surviving injury, surviving encounters with other human tribes, there is really not an abundance of dull moments. However, that doesn't mean there isn't any free time. And while to some cave people, simply sitting or laying around was more than enough fun because it meant that they weren't actively fighting for their life, for other prehistoric humans, they did desire just a bit more in life. And what spawned out of that desire to do more was one of the earliest developments in human expression, that being cave paintings. You see, as you sit there in the cave, you notice something on the ground, the remnants of last night's campfire, and in it are large chunks of charcoal. From previous experiences, you've learned that this charcoal leaves a distinct black residue, And today you decide to put that residue to good use and begin rubbing it on the wall in the cave. At first, you don't quite know what you're going to create. However, inspiration strikes, and you decide to honor the animal you killed that morning by creating a memorial for it on the wall of the cave. And just like that, you had created one of the many thousands of cave paintings created during the Stone Age. Cave paintings are undeniably one of the most iconic examples of Stone Age activity, let alone art. And while visually they seem quite simple, the lore behind them is pretty complex and still not fully understood. As far as we currently know from cave paintings we've been able to identify and roughly age, the activity and pastime of cave paintings date back as early as 30,000 BC. However, that doesn't exactly prove that's when cave paintings started. Those are just the oldest cave paintings we've been able to find so far. Cave paintings, shockingly, are found either on the walls or ceilings of deep natural caves, and the paintings themselves are typically drawn using rudimentary natural pigments like charcoal or clay. Stone Age humans would typically apply these pigments to their fingers and do finger paintings on the cave walls, which is pretty cute to imagine, but it's not the only method they used. In some cases, they would also fashion brushes using animal hair, or in other cases, they would literally blow the pigment through a hollow bone, like some sort of spitball gun, to create a rudimentary airbrush, which is pretty impressive. Most of the subjects of these cave paintings were animals: bison, deer, horses, woolly mammoths, and on the rare occasion, even humans. Now here's where things get interesting. While it is very possible that cave paintings were a form of leisure and only leisure, it is believed by some scholars that they had a much deeper meaning. For example, most cave paintings that have been found appear deep in caves far away from light, which has been interpreted by some scholars to prove that these paintings were intentional and meaningful, rather than simply just being a decorative piece of art. And while the exact meanings or intentions are unknown, these same scholars do believe that they are likely linked to some sort of ritualistic or spiritual beliefs that existed in the Stone Age. Or, at the very least, it was a simple form of record-keeping and storytelling. But unfortunately, this is all still speculation, and will likely remain so forever. But if nothing else, I would argue whoever was doing these cave paintings at least enjoyed the activity of it. And I don't know about you, but I would much rather do finger painting over saber-toothed tiger hunting any day of the week. Of course, the Stone Age fun does not end there. Because while cave paintings are iconic and memorable, they likely only took up a small percentage of the time spent during the day. And when Stone Age people weren't actively working on tasks required for survival, or creating unique and interesting art pieces, a majority of their free time were simply spent together. And while it may seem like a simple task, this time that humans spent together in groups was extremely foundational to what would later become human civilization. South African anthropologist James Soosman has even claimed that within certain tribes in South Africa, it appears that roughly 6 hours per day were dedicated solely to spending time with each other. And while the exact specifics are a bit foggy on what the Stone Age humans were doing, we know for a fact that at least some were spending large amounts of time with each other. And not necessarily for no reason either. On top of humans simply being social creatures, during the Stone Age, human survival was dependent on the group you lived in. And if your social standing was low, and you were exiled from your tribe, your chances of survival were essentially zero. During this time, man had natural predators, meaning the strength you had in numbers was gone, and you would soon become the lunch of a much larger animal. The Bronze Age. The Bronze Age is undoubtedly one of the most significant turning points in all of human history. And if you've seen any of my time period videos, you would know exactly why. The Bronze Age is when humans began transitioning out of pure hunter-gatherer tribes into early settled societies. And it's with these settled societies that we begin to see humanity and human activities begin to flourish. Most notably, leisure activities and pastimes. During the Bronze Age, nomadic tribes began building settlements. Early agriculture was being established. Animals were being domesticated. Trade was becoming extremely popular. And possibly, most importantly, humans began keeping records. Meaning, we have a lot more context and insight into exactly what people were doing for fun during this time period. Interestingly, while it may seem that people had a lot more to do during the Bronze Age, due to all of the advancements in human civilization and technology, people actually had more free time. And that's because more of their needs were beginning to be met. With the introduction of irrigation in agriculture and farming, as well as a reduction in the nomadic lifestyle, humans had a lot more time that was previously spent hunting, gathering, and traveling that can now be dedicated to other activities. And while some of this newfound time was dedicated to furthering technological discoveries or economic development, there was a good amount of time that could still be dedicated to leisure tasks. And with humans having more time and more technology to dedicate to their leisure, they were able to spawn some pretty interesting pastimes. And the one example that I'm going to highlight for the Bronze Age is ancient board games. One of the most famous examples of Bronze Age board games dates all the way back to 3100 BC in ancient Egypt. During this time, the Egyptians were playing a game that was known as Senet. And interestingly, just like how cave paintings weren't just a pastime in the Stone Age, the board game of Senet wasn't just a pastime in the Bronze Age. It actually held deep symbolic and religious meaning. But before we get to the meaning or gameplay, let's just take a look at the board itself. Senet boards vary in quality and size depending on whose it was, if it was the board of a royal or the board of a peasant. But regardless, all boards shared similar properties. A Senet board contained 3 rows of 10 squares, for a total of 30 squares, that is, on the top. Some Senet boards were flat, although many Senet boards themselves were actually a box, which contained a sliding compartment which would be used to hold the game pieces themselves, which is really quite interesting. And while for most regular Senet boards, they were typically rather portable or at least handheld, Senet boards that were owned by the royals were stationary and looked like tables themselves and were highly decorated and beautiful. Although, obviously, those were luxury items attainable by only a select few. The exact rules to the original game of Senet have been lost to time, unfortunately. And that's because this game fell out of popularity nearly 2,400 years ago. However, archaeologists did have enough context clues and supporting evidence to make their own modern recreation of the game, which goes as follows. Senet was a game that was meant to be played one-on-one. Each player would have a set of 5 to 7 pawns, and the goal was to move all of your pieces across the board. To move your pieces, you would use the ancient equivalent to dice, which were essentially sticks, or wooden dowels that were cut in half. These sticks would have a flat side and a rounded side. When you would throw these sticks, the amount of sticks that would have their flat side pointing up would equal how many spaces you could move. So for example, if you threw 4 sticks and 3 of them were flat side down and 1 of them was flat side up, you could move 1 square. From there, it is believed that the players would go back and forth, rolling these dice and moving their pawns in a game that was more or less a mix of chance and strategy to eventually move all of their pawns to the other side of the board and eventually win. The gameplay is almost like Snakes and Ladders, as the pawns would move in an S-shaped pattern across the board. And similar to Snakes and Ladders, parts on the board would have significant special meanings. For example, the 15th square on the board was known as the halfway point, or the House of Thoth, and symbolized the start of the soul's critical journey from the overworld to the underworld. Square 26 was known as the House of Rebirth, and is regarded as a safe square that offers protection in the afterlife. It is said to be a nod to the mummification process which was common in ancient Egypt. But in the context of the board game, what it really meant was landing here would give you a free turn. Square 27 was known as the House of Waters, and was actually a trap. If you landed on square 27, your pawn essentially drowned. It would be sent all the way back to square 15 or even to the start of the board depending on the rules you were playing. Square 28 was known as the House of Three Truths, and if you landed on this place, you would have to throw exactly 3 on the sticks to be able to advance. And square 29 was known as the House of Two Truths, and if you didn't throw exactly a 2, you would be sent back to the halfway point of square 15 once again. And finally, square 30 was known as the House of Horus. It was the final exit space, and if you could successfully land here with your pawn, you were essentially symbolizing the soul of your pawn uniting with the gods and achieving eternal life. As you can tell by my depiction of the gameplay alone, this game was deeply symbolic to the ancient Egyptians. And if it wasn't already obvious enough, this game was more or less a representation of the ancient Egyptians' beliefs about the soul and the afterlife. The board itself was a representation of the underworld. The pawns, or playing pieces, were a representation of the human soul, and the gameplay itself was a race between 2 people navigating through death into the afterlife, essentially fighting an uphill battle against the odds, which could be interpreted as fate, death, or a divine act of the gods. It's pretty crazy to think that such a simple board game had such a deep and significant spiritual meaning, and it just makes you think. If the game of Senet is a representation of the soul's journey going from the overworld to the underworld, what do other board games mean? For all we know, ancient checkers could have been the world's first dating simulator game. But degeneracy aside, during the Bronze Age, in my opinion, one of the most significant advancements in fun definitely comes in the form of the invention of the board game, creating, strengthening, and even destroying relationships on a daily basis. But in case board games wasn't significant enough for you, another potential pastime that could be argued was the act of record keeping. The Sumerians, who lived roughly 5,000 years ago in ancient Mesopotamia, were one of the earliest known civilizations to actually create written records, and we still have many of these records to this very day. These records were kept on clay tablets, and they were crucial for giving us context about the daily lives of people at this time. While for the most part these clay tablets were used for practical purposes such as record keeping, administration, communicating, and other things of the sort, I'm sure there are clay tablets out there that were carved for the sole purpose of leisure. Perhaps documenting the day of an ancient Sumerian, or even detailing the beauty of a flower a tablet carver once saw, essentially serving as the world's most difficult journal. The Iron Age. Unlike the dramatic shift in civilization we saw from the Stone Age to the Bronze Age, the Iron Age is relatively similar to the age that came before it, with even more technological and societal developments. Although it definitely wasn't a linear progression. It's a bit outside of the scope of this exact video, but the transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age was actually a pretty tumultuous time in history. And to summarize it in the most simple terms possible, humanity essentially took 2 steps forward and 1 step backward when transitioning from the Stone Age to Bronze Age and Bronze Age to Iron Age. Regardless, like humans always do, we figured it out. And not only did we figure out how to rebuild society, we also figured out new ways to have fun. And in my opinion, this is one of the coolest pastimes we've discussed so far. One of the most notable civilizations from the Iron Age was ancient Greece. And with ancient Greece came the Olympic Games, one of the most culturally significant events at the time that still remains to this very day. Even in the modern day, with all of the entertainment and luxuries that we have, the Olympic Games are still one of the most fun things to observe and I'm sure participate in if you are so inclined. However, during ancient Greece, when life was a lot more boring and the Olympic Games were a lot more intense, I could only imagine how much fun it would be to be in the live crowd of the ancient Greek Olympics. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself, so let me give some context. The Olympic Games started in 776 BC, and they were initially meant to bring together the Greek city-states for some peaceful competition and celebration of athleticism and religious devotion. The Olympic Games themselves were actually held in honor of Zeus, the king of gods. And it was for that reason that the Olympic Games were deeply religiously important and also culturally significant. Back in the Iron Age, only free men could compete in the Olympic Games, meaning no slaves, no prisoners, and no women. And interestingly, at most Olympic Games, most women weren't even able to watch the Olympic Games due to the sheer amount of nudity that was present during some of the events, which is interesting. Some of the earliest Olympic Games consisted of weightlifting, foot races, and combat sports, including wrestling and all-out, no-holds-barred, no-rules fighting that allowed eye gouging, biting, and often resulted in death. But in case watching ancient Greek oiled-up buff guys do sports wasn't enough, there was also another type of event that took place in ancient Greece during the Iron Age that was also pretty interesting and possibly just as cool. That being the drinking contests at symposia. You see, during ancient Greece, there was things known as symposia, which were essentially formal gatherings of intellectuals to speak about philosophy, religion, and other topics. And as the symposia grew in popularity and became a bigger and bigger event, they added more games, more food, and eventually added more festivities, with one of the most notable being the drinking contests, which, in my opinion, were simple but hilarious. While the original purpose of this event was to discuss philosophy and religion, by the end of the day, it would quickly devolve into a drunken yelling match amongst all of the participants of this random drinking game. How it worked was essentially like an ancient hot dog eating contest. A group of ancient Greeks would line up beside each other, they would all be given a certain number of glasses of wine, and the entire goal of the contest was to either drink the most wine, stay sober the longest, or keep drinking the longest without throwing up or passing out. And it's unsurprising that there is recorded history of many of these events turning extremely rowdy, and in some cases even resulting in death due to alcohol poisoning. Almost hilariously, scholars believe that these drinking contests were likely a way to prove masculinity and endurance, even though in most cases they typically just ended in embarrassment. And while during the Olympic Games, Olympians, at least those who won, were highly regarded and granted glory and fame, it's hard to say whatever came of the winners of the drinking contests of ancient Greece. But yeah, if you ever got teleported to ancient Greece and were looking for something fun to do, 2 notable options are going to the Olympic Games if you happen to be there at the right time, or at the very least, power chugging wine and seeing where the night takes you. The Classical Era. The Classical Era is a relatively short and niche era of history, and for that reason, it's going to receive a relatively short section, although I figured it was worth mentioning for a few reasons. During the Classical Era, or the Classical Antiquity, specifically in Greece and Rome, live entertainment was at the forefront of fun, and was becoming exponentially more complex, important, and organized. Greek theater and festivals eventually grew so much in popularity they were considered an essential part of daily life. and participation in these live events by locals was essentially mandatory. And because many Greeks were able to have leisure time due to the fact that slave labor was doing a lot of grunt work in ancient Greek society, meant the upper classes could not only go to these events but help support the events to make them larger. Although, of course, none of those funds would go to the people putting on the show, just the ones you saw on stage. Regardless, besides the development of theater in ancient Greece, we also saw the development of work-life balance over in Rome. Possibly for the first time ever, the Romans began to separate the concepts of work time and leisure time, and they even created individual words for each of these tasks. Otium was the word for leisure, and negotium was the word for business or work. And it's believed that with these words came strong meaning, and belief that when it was time to work, you worked and only worked. However, when it was time for leisure, you did absolutely nothing strenuous or laborious, showing that even thousands of years ago, at least in Rome, having a work-life balance was not only a recognized benefit to society, but something that was strongly believed in. On top of the Romans' work-life balance, they also increased their entertainment over time as well, with one of the most notable examples of that being the opening of the Colosseum in 80 AD, where at the Colosseum, they would typically hold 100 live events per year, almost one every 3 days. Meaning that if you lived in Rome during this time, multiple times per week you could go to watch a live event and be treated to live entertainment for hours. And while at this point, theater and live entertainment is nothing new, I figured it'd be quickly worth mentioning the documented history of the work-life balance, as well as the development of live events, at least in the Mediterranean. The medieval era. During the medieval era, civilization and society is really starting to resemble the one we know today, although with a few unique differences. And while there are countless interesting hobbies and pastimes that people would have done for fun during the medieval era, there are two that are very specific to the medieval era I'd like to quickly discuss. For starters, when you think of the medieval era, it's almost impossible to not think of medieval knights. And what are medieval knights possibly most known for? Well, of course, jousting. And similar to the gladiatorial games that they had in Rome, or the Olympic Games they had in Greece, jousting in medieval Europe was an extremely popular and culturally significant live sporting event that would not only make legends, but also take lives. Jousting, for those of you who were literally born yesterday, is essentially two knights on horseback charging at each other with large wooden spears, or lances as they're called. The entire point of this game or sport was to unhorse your opponent, or essentially knock them off of their horse. And this entire activity was a test of skill, strength, and courage to ultimately prove your worthiness and your knightly honor. Jousting, for those who participated, I'm sure it was a blast, at least for those who were good at it. Although, since there was more people that were spectating than actually participating, I'm going to speak about it from a spectator's perspective. Jousting tournaments, wherever they were held, always drew a major crowd, and they were typically held at royal occasions, at the site of military victories, or even at religious festivals. And even though during medieval Europe, the economic divide in society was jarring, jousting was one sport that could bring all classes of society together, because literally everybody from the bottom of the economic food chain to the top enjoyed this sport deeply. Even after gunpowder was introduced into warfare, making blade combat less and less effective, jousting still remained popular as a symbolic event, still of honor and of medieval history. Personally, I'm not sure if I would have had more fun watching medieval jousting over the Greek Olympic Games or even a Greek drinking competition. However, I'm sure the medieval jousting events would have had their own unique flair that I would have enjoyed if I was there in the time. But I do think this is one of the first examples where the pastime I chose in a future section is actually less entertaining than the one before it. But that's just me. What would you guys rather watch? Some of the original Olympic Games or authentic medieval jousting? Honestly, you can't go wrong, but I'm curious what you would rather watch and why. But if you're gonna leave a comment on this video, you might as well leave a like as well. And if you're gonna like this video, you might as well subscribe if you haven't already, because I post videos like this every single week. And if you want to stay up to date with the content I'm posting, subscribing is the best way to be informed. Transparently, I haven't made one of my time period videos in a long time. Although, if this is something that you guys would like more of, I'd be more than happy to make more of these era-based videos. The best way to let me know that you want more content like this is either by leaving a like or leave a comment below. And I'll do my absolute best to make the videos that I know you guys would love to see. But with that, let's finish out this video. The early modern era. Even though the early modern era only consists of roughly 300 years of history, because it is placed in a time of such massive human and societal development, there is literally an endless plethora of unique pastimes I could talk about for people having fun in the early modern era. And it's for that reason that I'm not going to go super in-depth about any one activity, and I'm going to kind of do a speed round of a bunch of unique activities that people were just doing in the early modern era that I figured would be worth mentioning. During the 1800s in Europe, specifically Victorian England, an interesting trend and hobby arose known as mummy unrollings. During this time in history, there is a massive cultural obsession with Egypt in Europe, and general ancient civilizations as a whole. And one of the most unique forms of entertainment that came out of this obsession and public curiosity was the public unwrapping of ancient Egyptian mummified remains. At first, these mummy rolling events were typically only held or experienced by people that worked in the scientific field, as these mummies were hard to come by and the bodies themselves were controlled. But interestingly, after the 1832 Autonomy Act in Britain, doctors were granted more legal access to human bodies for dissection and study. And as an unintentional result, this allowed doctors to essentially more freely distribute mummified bodies, which were eventually used for mummy unrollings in hospitals, scientific institutions, and in some cases even private parties where tickets were sold, making the event much less about science and much more about pure curiosity and morbid entertainment. During the early modern era over in America, people weren't necessarily unraveling mummies, but they were playing with fire, or at least electricity. During the late part of the 18th century, in America and parts of Europe, public fascination with electricity began to grow like wildfire. And the result of this was electrotherapy parties. Like the money unwrappings, these electrotherapy parties were kind of branded as some sort of pseudo-scientific event, but it was really more so just to satisfy a curiosity and to have some fun. Although in this case, in a much less morbid way. Electrotherapy parties would essentially consist of a bunch of friends hanging out, playing with electricity to have a bit of a shock. No pun intended. People at the party would willingly subject themselves to mild electric shocks, typically static shock, for both amusement and suspected health benefits. People that commonly threw electrotherapy parties were either doctors, amateur scientists, or just rich people who were looking for something fun to do. But regardless, the intentions were the same. They wanted to show their friends how they could make their hair stand up, and they wanted to show how they could make a small strike of lightning with their finger touching a piece of metal. By modern standards, electrotherapy parties sound absolutely insane. But it is pretty cool and honestly a bit cute to see the innocent curiosity in electricity, and it's super fascinating to see how much our relationship with electricity has evolved over the last few hundred years. Like, could you imagine doctors, scientists, and rich guys like 300 years ago just sitting in a dark room with a balloon, rubbing it on their heads and touching it just to kind of giggle and laugh all about it? Like, that's hilarious. But in case those two weren't enough, two other interesting things that went on specifically during the Victorian era in Victorian England was hair collecting and headless portraits. Headless portraits were essentially just a photography fad that was born out of the fascination of the eerie and unusual in Victorian England. How this would work was photographers would manipulate how early cameras would work to essentially take a picture of an individual as if they were holding their own head in their hands. This was a very early Snapchat filter, or a very early version of Photoshop. It's kind of funny how this was a big trend hundreds of years ago. It's cool to see, once again, how far photography and creative media has evolved over time. And in regards to hair collecting, many women in Victorian England were extremely sentimental, and human hair had deep sentimental value, and for that reason was saved and used for crafts, or even in jewelry making as keepsakes to basically keep their loved ones around them, which is a lot more sweet when you hear that context rather than just hearing hair collecting. The modern era. In the modern era, the ways that people have fun and entertain themselves varies drastically. But one notable and relatable example I can give is either laying on your couch or laying in your bed, watching a stick figure who's not qualified to talk about anything, essentially talk about everything, on a media platform known as YouTube. Seriously though, it is crazy to see exactly how much fun, leisure, and entertainment has evolved over the last roughly 10,000 years. And while this video was a massive oversimplification of a lot of different complex topics and historical events, I hope it at least gives you a good idea of a few unique examples of how people entertained themselves in different eras of history. And while I probably don't need to tell you how people have fun in the modern day, I think a few notable examples that are relevant to this video are the rise of cinema, and with that, the rise of independent entertainment with social media platforms like Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. Thousands of years ago, we saw the introduction of gladiatorial games and massive, large-scale theatrical plays. And interestingly, we still have very close remnants of those in the modern day. We have the UFC, we have WWE, we have movies, and we still very much so have live-action plays. If anything, one of the most unique forms of entertainment and fun in the modern era are video games. And while this form of entertainment is probably the most unique compared to all of the others we've discussed, you could say that they very much so have a strong lineage in board games, which in themselves originated over 4,000 years ago, which is cool to see exactly how much development has happened throughout human history, and how much of the things we use today are actually based in ancient history. Things you pay for that actually used to be free. It is a crisp Saturday morning, and you are waking up excited because you know that today is the day they open the Christmas market. You love local vendors, knickknacks, fresh foods, and of course, community functions, which is why you quickly get out of bed, get ready, and head on to the Christmas market. Craft fairs and events are so fun. However, they used to be more fun because once upon a time, they weren't so expensive. Let me explain. As soon as you approach the event center in your car, you notice your first issue. While the event center has plenty of parking, none of it is available for free. Which brings us to the first thing that used to be free that now we have to pay for. Parking. Admittedly, it's been a long time since general parking has been free, and this may come as a shock to even the older Trust Me Bro viewers. But believe it or not, once upon a time, most, if not all, public parking was free. But this all began to change, at least in the United States, in the 1930s, specifically January of 1935, when Oklahoma City installed its first parking meter. Parking meters, of course, are the things you ignore when you park somewhere publicly. Joking, they are the place you put in coins so you can voluntarily scam yourself to place your car somewhere to go spend money at a business. I don't necessarily have a personal vendetta against parking meters. However, I do think they're a bit of a net negative for people that are doing some local shopping trying to stimulate the local economy, at least in the modern day. Because sure, in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, there was really nothing besides brick and mortar, unless you count the Sears catalog. However, going to an in-person store was still very much so the rage. But now, in 2025, when you have Amazon and other online retailers, why would you spend money to park somewhere to then go buy something if you could, well, just order it online and get it to your door shipped for free? Now, to be fair, the whole parking lot business has always existed, opening a private parking lot with the sole intention of charging for parking. However, what I'm more specifically referring to here is either public government-owned parking lots or private parking lots owned by businesses now charging as well. As I stated, in 1935, the first parking meter was invented and used by the government, and that invention quickly spread across the entire nation. But it wasn't until the 1950s where other locations started charging for parking as well, more specifically, airports. In the early days of aviation, parking at airports was free, and it was also rather simple. It was typically just a large patch of grass beside the airport that, leave your car, no worries. But as the demand for travel began to ramp up after World War II, airport parking began to develop more, and quickly airports realized that, hey, while parking is a great value add, it's also something we can monetize. And monetize they did. And quickly, within a span of only a few decades, airports went from offering free parking to having parking be one of their major revenue generation streams. But because you're an event center in 2025 and not an airport in the 1950s, you submit to your reality, pay to park your car, and begin to head into the event center to experience the Christmas market. As you enter the event center, you feel the wave of warm air and your nostrils are full of Christmas cheer. And it's not, because it was cold out. But before you can even reach the first vendor of this Christmas market, you are met with a table. And behind this table are two middle-aged women named Tammy and Karen. And Tammy and Karen run this Christmas market. And they're not letting you into this craft show until you pay the fee. Which brings us to our next entry that actually used to be free. Admission to craft fair and, well, a lot of public events. For craft fairs and markets alike, there's no specific date when every event organizer decided to charge a cover. However, it's become extremely obvious that over the past few decades, the trend of charging a cover to even enter a market to support local business has become more and more common. And I'm assuming many of my market goers can attest to this. Now, I want to make it very clear that there are still a ton of free markets in the modern day. And there is a small number of markets that simply charge a cover fee to directly support a charity that they are also contributing to. And that I'm fine with. However, in the vast majority of cases, it seems like more and more markets and events in general are simply charging a cover every year to optimize revenue generation. Now here's the deal. I'm not knocking the hustle. I'm a business bro. If you want to charge for people to come into your event, that's totally fine. But I think it's important that we understand the context. A $5 cover at a local nightclub versus the $5 cover at a local Christmas market are two different things, at least in my opinion. And if you want to maximize the number of patrons in your market to ensure that your vendors are able to become profitable, well, I would try to make sure that people can get in for free. And personally, I think the best way to go about this is have entry be free and also make donations optional. That way people are aware of the charity and can give if they'd like without being obligated. But regardless, back to Tammy and Karen. Upon becoming face-to-face with Tammy and Karen, you know there's no way around the situation besides paying them. Because their ugly Christmas sweaters have made it obvious that they're willing to lay their life on the line to ensure you pay admission. However, After paying for parking and after paying Tammy and Karen, you are relieved to be in the place you've been excited about all day. However, you've just been hit with one major issue. With this being a local small town market, you're going to need cash to buy your favorite trinkets. And because of the fees you've already paid, your cash supply is looking low. However, you're in luck because as soon as you notice that your wallet is essentially empty, you notice something in your peripheral. A beautiful, shiny ATM. And this ATM brings us to our next charge that actually used to be free. You see, the first ATM prototypes were invented in the 1960s, but it wasn't until the late 1970s and early 1980s when ATMs began popping up around the United States. During the early days of ATM machines, that being the late 80s and early 90s, ATMs were nearly exclusively owned by banks and either charged an extremely low fee of roughly 10 cents or no fee at all as a free perk to customers of a certain bank. And this tradition is still true to this day. Many of you, if you go to your bank's specific ATM, can take out cash absolutely free, and that's great. However, when you're out and about, or, at a Christmas market or your favorite gentleman's club, you're not going to your bank's branded ATM machine. You're going to a sketchy gray box that is begging for your credit card information. Now look, independent ATMs have been around nearly as long as ATMs in general. However, everything changed for ATM fees in 1996. And the reason for this is because prior to April of 1996, independent ATM owners were actually banned for charging a surcharge on transactions. Meaning that if you were in a public place before 1996, you may receive a charge for using an ATM, but the charge that you were receiving was from your bank for not using their ATM, which admittedly is already sneaky because banks were like, hey, use our ATM, they're free. But if you use anybody else's, we're gonna charge you for using their machine. Wild. Regardless, after a major industry ruling in April of 1996, the ban was lifted, meaning that independent ATM operators could now charge their own direct surcharge on their machines as well. And this opened the floodgates for basically voluntary extortion. Because now, if you're using a generic ATM owned by an independent person, not only are you paying your bank for a foreign fee for not using their own branded ATM, but now you're paying the ATM owner a separate fee, meaning that you're paying two separate fees just to take out cash. And if you're only taking out 20 bucks, for example, you could be paying nearly 20 to 40% of that additionally in fees just to get that cash, which is ridiculous. In 1998, the average combined fee from both the bank and the ATM owner was $1.97 per transaction. However, in 2025, this average has now gone up to $4.86 per transaction just to receive cash from a generic ATM, which of course is the most common. I know this one's a bit on the line because technically there are still free ATMs if you're willing to drive across town, and ATMs themselves were never really free because of the foreign fee your bank charged. However, I think it's kind of obvious to see why this entry fits on this list, because once upon a time, ATMs were cheap and only had one fee. Now, ATM fees have quadrupled, and you're getting charged by multiple merchants just to get cash you already have. This isn't a loan. This is literally your money. Feeling like you're not ready for another scam right now, you actually cancel the transaction after seeing a $20 ATM fee, and you make your way out of the event space. Disappointed because your Christmas market experience was ruined. But it's not gonna ruin your day. You get back into your car after you already paid for parking, and you decide you're going to go to a national park and enjoy some pure nature. Almost immediately after leaving the parking lot, you realize that one of your tires is low and your gas tank is nearly empty. However, luckily, a gas station is not far away. As you pull into the gas station, you find the air pump and park directly in front of it, running into the next thing that used to be free but isn't anymore. As you get out of your car and approach the air pump, you see a price tag, $1.50 for 4 minutes of air. Now, this isn't the most expensive thing you've ever done, but come on, we're paying for air now? And sure, of course, you're paying to use this air compressor. However, this is a gas station and they're already hyper optimized for revenue. They have gas, lottery, tobacco, alcohol, fake labubus. They've got it all. And of course, chips. I think most of the people watching this video have always had to pay for air if they've ever had to pay for air. However, there was a time when these air compressors for putting air in your tire were a free service that in some cases they would even do for you. But we'll get to that in a second. Prior to the 1970s, it was basically commonplace to be offering free air at any gas station. However, during the 1970s, charging for air became more and more of a thing. And it wasn't until the 1990s when it was basically commonplace to be charging 25 cents to $1 for compressed air. And now in the modern day, there is literally air pumps that accept credit cards. And who knows, maybe they'll start accepting crypto soon too. Just think of that utopian future, spending 10,000 poop coin to put air in your tires. What a dream. However, when it comes to compressed air, there is a bit of a silver lining, and some of you are already typing a comment about it right now. And that silver lining is that some states in the United States, while they allow you to charge for compressed air, require that you offer compressed air for free if asked. That's right, this is a scam you can actually work around. If you pull up to an air pump at a gas station and they're charging for air, simply go inside, use your charisma to pass a speech check, and they will turn on the compressor absolutely free, at least in some places where they're required to. As you finish airing up your tire, you pull your car into the bay and begin filling your car with gasoline, which brings us to our next gas station related thing you pay for that used to be free. But in this case, you don't pay for it, you just don't get it anymore. That being a service. You see, prior to the 1970s, full service gas stations were all the rage. And at these gas stations, not only would they pump your gas for you, but they would also wipe your windows and even check your tire pressure. And this honestly sounds dope and like a good move for safety. Because imagine if you pull up to get gas and somebody who's knowledgeable about cars takes a quick look at your tires, realizes there's either a nail in it or your tires are literally bald, and even just, suggests, hey, get that fixed soon, but for now I just topped up the air. That could literally save lives. But of course, it costs money, so it'll never work. As I mentioned earlier, in the 1970s, there was a large transition from full-service gas stations to self-serve gas stations. And with this change came a lot less service and a lot more charges. Now, of course, in the modern day, there are still a few full-serve gas stations that exist. However, gas at these stations are always more expensive, and tipping culture has basically made that experience, well, awkward or more expensive than it probably should be. But yeah, even though you can still technically wash your windows with the dirtiest, stinkiest fluid you've ever seen for free, there was a point in time when if you were getting gas, the gas station was so grateful for your business that they would fill your car for you, clean your window for you, top off your tires, and maybe even tell you that your pinstripe suit looked good. But obviously it's not all sunshine and rainbows, because literally during this time in the 60s and 70s, leaded gasoline was a big thing. And if you don't know what leaded gasoline was doing to people, well, watch some of my serial killer videos. After leaving the gas station, you are finally back on the road and headed to your fortunately local national park. As you drive up the heavily wooded road, you get to the entrance of the park. And as you meet the employee in the little box, you are given a small map, and then they are asking you to pay the admission. Obviously, paying an admission at a national park is commonplace, but that wasn't always the case. Prior to 1972, basically every national park in the United States was free to enter and even camp in. Until, of course, that changed forever. Now, not every national park was free. As a rule, there was a few that were charging small fees, but a vast majority of national parks were completely free to enter and use. However, in 1972, a federal law was amended that authorized recreational fees for every national park. And since 1972, everything has essentially flipped to where now over 111 national parks in the United States charge an entrance fee. And these fees range from $10 to $35 per vehicle, depending on the park. Now, once again, the silver lining is that there are free days at certain parks at certain times, but obviously it is still a stark contrast. Now, once again, I'm not hating on this, and everything on this list isn't like a personal statement, it's just a fact. It used to be free and now it's not. I'm not against national parks having better management and better upkeep. However, with national parks, at least in the United States, for example, being federally operated, it does seem a bit ironic that tax dollars are supposed to be spent on maintaining these parks, but instead we are now paying taxes and also paying to maintain these parks additionally with their taxes, once again being double dipped on fees. But with that being said, if national parks are underfunded and need to charge, well, I'm not against it, because national parks are important and deserve to be well maintained. But just know, prior to 1972, they were free. Here's the deal. You kind of forgot that you had no cash, so embarrassingly, you had to turn around. Fortunately, out of pity, the ranger lets you keep the map and you drive home. As you get back home, you decide that you're just done with the day. The market you were looking forward to was a bust, the park was a bust, and it's now time to just sit on the couch and watch some TV for a bit and really decompress. That is, until you realize that none of the channels that you typically watch are working. And then you get an email on your phone saying that your cable has been suspended because of a failed payment. Which, surprisingly, brings us to our next thing that used to actually be free. You see, before the days of streaming services and overpriced TV channels, television broadcasting as a whole was free. In the early days of television, from roughly the 1930s to 1950s, regular TV broadcasts were free, either being funded by advertisements or, more commonly, public funds. And how the setup would work essentially is if you bought a TV and had an antenna, you could access these channels and have free entertainment on your brand new television ready to go. And this for decades was the standard and provided anybody with an antenna access to channels like ABC, NBC, CBS, PBS, and other local channels. Now, granted, these free options still exist to this very day. However, good luck trying to be genuinely entertained by only using free television options. Because even back in the 50s, people were getting bored of that pretty quick, which is why TV began to quickly shift into a monthly paid model, specifically in the 1970s and 80s. What happened during this time with the introduction of cable TV was the additional introduction of specialized channels. And these specific channels focused on things like news or sports and were funded solely by subscription fees and, once again, advertisements. And since that introduction of paid channels in the 1970s and 80s, media streaming has changed forever and evolved quite rapidly since then. And it's kind of ironically evolving so quickly that it's almost repeating itself. And what I mean by that is in the late 2000s and early 2010s, there was a movement online known as cutting the cable, which was exactly what it sounded like. People were fed up because they were paying so many subscriptions just to watch TV. And it truly was getting egregious and expensive, and people had to really make some tough decisions about what channels they were going to subscribe to. It was around the same time when digital streaming was becoming more and more popular, and it was starting to seem like streaming could be a potential alternative to traditional TV. And while it did for some time, I think for the most part it's just kind of repeating itself, because now so many people are subscribed to so many different streaming services at once, they're not even saving money. And now we no longer have specialized channels, we have specialized streaming services, all available on your smart TV. It was reported in a study from 2023 that the average household in America is subscribed to at least 4 subscription services. And with most services being anywhere from $5 to $15 per month, we can average it out to roughly $40 per month, or almost $500 a year in subscription services. I personally have no beef with streaming services, but it is ironic how quickly streaming turned from an alternative to TV to the new TV with the internet. After feeling enraged that the only source of comfort has been suspended because of your lack of funds, you realize that you at least can make your payment without using cash or even leaving your home. So you quickly pick up the phone and dial your cable provider. And they tell you that yes, they could totally take a separate credit card over the phone to reinstate your services. And while this sounds all fine and dandy, this actually brings us to our next, no longer free service. You see, before the 2000s, you could pay most of your bills via the phone, and that was one of the most convenient ways of doing so because the internet was still early and paying bills was more of a hassle than it is today. But interestingly, as online billing became more and more common, companies wanted to deal with over-the-phone bill payments as little as possible. Originally because over-the-phone bill payments cost more money because they had to have a live agent to receive this information and input it. And while that alone is a bit egregious because, well, you're already paying for the larger service, so that small service should be included considering how little time that one transaction takes. What's even more egregious and kind of hilarious is that after real phone attendants were replaced with automated systems, these companies still continued to charge for any bill payment being made over the phone, which is just hilarious. This one might seem like it doesn't really affect anybody because who pays bills over the phone anymore? But realize that just because something doesn't affect you, that doesn't mean it doesn't affect anyone. And for example, just imagine your sweet old grandmother who likes to pay all her bills over the phone because to her, it's still the most convenient way. Well, in the late 90s and early 2000s, that was completely fine. But now, let's say she's paying 5 different bills over the phone, with each of these bills having an additional $5 to $10 over the phone fee. Your sweet old grandmother could be paying an extra $25 to $50 per month just on fees for literally making her payment to things she already pays for. I don't know about you, but that's not really cool in my book. But regardless of what anybody thinks, it used to be free and it's not anymore. After being told that paying your bill over the phone will result in an extra charge, you decide that it's better to just let the cable default and you can put your energy elsewhere, which is exactly when you notice your Xbox controller on your table. You decide that if you can't watch TV, playing video games is the second best way to truly blow off some steam. However, as soon as you load up the latest Call of Duty, you realize there is a serious problem with gaming. You see, video games never were free per se. However, the video game industry has definitely taken a stark turn ever since microtransactions came around. And no, I'm not talking about mobile apps charging 99 cents to have the full game unlocked. I'm talking about $100 AAA titles begging you to spend an additional $40 on extra skins and DLCs, while also on top of that paying an additional $20 per month for a battle pass. And I'm talking in Canadian dollars, and I'm looking at you, Call of Duty. Like, here's the deal. Video games are expensive, but they're not even complete anymore. Not only are video games, for the most part, released basically unfinished, but they also always drop with additional content that you have to pay extra for, as if the price of the game is not enough. When I was growing up, I loved playing MW2 on the PS3, and it was simple. Get headshots, unlock camos, it was fun and simple, it made perfect sense. Now, if you play Call of Duty, you can unlock some basic camos, but to get the really cool ones in the blueprints and the skins, you can get the Battle Pass for a monthly subscription, or buy them outright with cash, or you can even buy and stack up your COD points, which has a crazy looking currency because of the acronym. Regardless, within our lifetimes, video games went from being full products with one price to being full games that you could buy additional add-ons later when they decided to create new content for the game, you know, DLCs that were actually additive and worth the money, to now having video games that are both paid and free, doing everything that they can to A, steal your information, and B, make you spend as much money as possible. Like, it's one thing having a free game have additional extras. For example, you know, Fortnite. I think Fortnite's at least reasonable because you can enjoy Fortnite fully, completely free. And there's a lot of user-generated games on there that you can play for free. And sure, there's an item shop that updates daily. If you have at least a bit of self-discipline, you don't have to spend money on there. Although it's definitely a slippery slope. However, with Call of Duty, for example, there is, in my opinion, no excuse to have a full-priced game have so much paid content on top. But if you haven't noticed, this was one of the entries that definitely has affected me personally, which is why it was a bit more passion-filled. But here's the thing. I know my audience, and I know that this was probably one of the most impactful on you guys too, because this literally changed in our lifetimes. This wasn't free in the 70s and paid for now. This was literally, hey, games used to be one price, and now it's a cover charge, a surcharge, and everything in between. Basically, everything we've talked about in all of the other sections has happened within gaming in the last 1 to 2 decades, and it's crazy. And it's for this reason that you put down the controller, you turn off Call of Duty, and you decide that you're going to just take a vacation, because you are done with being charged for things that used to be free. And while it may seem crazy for somebody with no money to go on vacation, what's even crazier is the fact that nearly 75% of you watching this video right now are not even subscribed. So I just wanted to say, if you're enjoying these videos and want to see cool videos from me weekly, consider subscribing. And if you are subscribed, consider turning on notifications so you know exactly when I post. And maybe you can get the first comment, because everybody loves people that comment first. But let's move on. Deciding to put your full tires and full tank of gas to good use, you drive yourself to the airport, where you once again get scammed to pay to park, and then you head inside. As of right now, you have no tickets, so you head to the kiosk and begin the process of losing all of your money. The first question that the kiosk asks you is if you are going to be checking a bag. And because you wanted to leave and never came back, you did have a bag you wanted to check. And after ticking off that box, you were instantly met with an additional charge, that being a bag checking charge. And this charge is actually relatively recent. You see, airlines only started charging for checked bags, at least in the US, in 2008, with American Airlines being the first major carrier to introduce this fee on domestic flights. The fee was, air quotes, only $15, but now with this fee essentially being an industry standard and only going up over the last decade, checking bags has gone from being something that was part of your ticket price to now being a scam you can't escape. In 2025, checked bags can range from anywhere from $25 to $60 per bag you check, and that can increase exponentially depending on how heavy your luggage is. And assuming that your original ticket price was only $100 for a short domestic flight, it is now 60% more expensive with a $100 ticket price and now a $60 checked bag fee, and we're only just getting started. After being asked if you wanted to check any bags, the kiosk now asks you if you want to select your seat. Obviously, you don't want to sit just anywhere, so you opt to select your seat. And while at first this may seem like an easy, free feature because it's a first-come, first-served system, you would be gravely mistaken. Because once again, around 2008, airlines started experimenting with charging for seat selection, seeing it as an upsell rather than a common courtesy for people that were booking early. And once again, almost like everything else on this list, something that started out as an experimental charge has now become a significant revenue stream for nearly every major airline. And now, after selecting your seat, you have an additional $20 charge on your original $100 plane ticket. Now that your plane ticket is 80% more expensive than it was originally advertised at, you're certain that it couldn't get any worse. That is, until you're met with the next question: would you like to eat on the flight? And considering the fact you'd be trapped in a metal tube for 6 hours, you decide that eating would be good. But of course, it would not be free. See, most domestic airlines within the United States offer at least some sort of snack on most flights, whether it be a small glass of water or a bag of small peanuts. However, did you know that in the United States, even short domestic flights were offered free meals for the longest time? So when do you think that domestic in-flight meals went from free to paid? Well, the answer, sadly, is 2001. Prior to 2001, almost every flight that was taken, whether it be short haul, long haul, domestic, international, included some sort of free meal. Not snack, meal. However, after 2001, many changes took place, with the one that we're discussing right now being the removal of complimentary meals for any flight that wasn't a long-haul international flight, because those are literally required. Because if you're going in between countries and spending over 8 hours in the sky, they kind of have to feed you. But if you're taking a domestic flight in the US, good luck getting a meal without paying for it. And once again, you pay for this additional add-on, and you have now officially doubled the price of your plane ticket in only 3 clicks by purchasing add-ons for your flight that were all free not even 20 years ago. Except for the meals, but you know what I mean. And with that, you pay for your ticket, print it out, and you go on your lovely vacation. But now you might be asking yourself, hey, wait, in this story, the character walked out of the Christmas market because there's an ATM fee, he turned around at the national park because there was an entrance fee, and he canceled his cable bill because he had no money in his account. Why did you just all of a sudden buy every add-on on the flight? And the answer is truly quite simple. The credit card he used wasn't his. And while credit card fraud and identity theft are no laughing matter, in this hypothetical story, they allowed you to go on vacation stress-free. The luckiest people who survived the impossible. Frane Salak. Frane was born in June of 1929 in Yugoslavia. He was born unexpectedly 2 months early while his parents were on a boat in the Adriatic Sea. Fortunately, both him and his mother survived, and it's reported that his father even cut the umbilical cord with a fishing knife. When Frane was only 11 months old, he had life-threatening intestinal issues that nearly took his life. And at 11 years old, Frane nearly lost his eyesight completely, but reportedly recovered due to his mother's prayers to Saint Teresa and a nun's herbal medicine. Already, the childhood of Frane sounds like somebody who survived deadly and dangerous situations multiple times. But believe it or not, the childhood of Frane Salek is actually some of the most peaceful times in his entire life. And the situations that made him now famous actually all took place after the age of 33 years old. From the age of 11 to 33, Frane lived a relatively normal life. He went to music school, became a music teacher, got married, got divorced, had a child, and got remarried, essentially living the standard Eastern European way of life. However, it was that way of life that was challenged on a train ride from Bosnia to Yugoslavia in January of 1962. According to Frane himself, he was riding this train home from work, and he was on this train with the elderly mother of the mayor of Stone. Stone being a neighboring city to the one he was born in Croatia. According to Frane, the elderly mayor's mother was his responsibility to protect, and that he did. During the train ride on this cold, rainy day, the train is traveling along a canyon. And while the landscape of this canyon was beautiful, the conditions of this canyon were about to put him in a situation far from it. It's believed that only hours prior to this train voyage, a small mudslide near the top of the canyon caused a rockfall to land directly on the train track. And while this went unnoticed by the train conductor, when the train hit the rocks on the track, it successfully derailed the train, plunging the train into freezing cold waters. According to Frane, after the train hit the water, he told the old woman to hold on to him and hold her nose as he broke the train window with his elbow and successfully swam him and the old woman to shore, although Frane did sustain a broken arm and hypothermia. And while Frane and this elderly woman did survive, the 17 other passengers on the train unfortunately passed away in the accident. That situation alone is the story of a lifetime. Although for Frane, this is only the beginning of his multi-chapter story with his close encounters with death. Only a year later, after the alleged heroic train situation, in 1963, Frane would find himself in another life-threatening situation. During this time, Frane is teaching music in Slovenia as part of his service in a military band for the Yugoslavians People Party. Although, during his time abroad, he receives a desperate call from his mother, and she informs Frane that she has been hospitalized and desperately needs him to come visit her, as this might be his last opportunity to say goodbye. Obviously, understanding the severity of his situation, Frane books the next flight from Slovenia back to Croatia. And only hours after receiving this desperate call, he is in the air. The aircraft he's on is known as a DC-10, and while it's a relatively large plane, this flight only has 17 passengers and 4 crew aboard. And at some point during this short flight, Frane begins to strike up a conversation with the flight attendant near an emergency exit to try to calm his nerves. This was his first flight ever, and it coincidentally ended up being his last as well. Frane has told reporters that during his conversation with the flight attendant, he heard a massive bang on the plane, and then almost immediately after, the exit door was ripped off of the plane behind him, causing the change in pressure to suck him out of the airplane. It is then alleged that he fell 800 meters before harshly landing in a haystack in a small farm village in Croatia. According to Frayne, he spent 4 days in a coma and then woke up in the hospital, where he learned that he had no serious injuries besides the loss of consciousness and, well, coma. During interviews decades after the incident took place, Frayne also reported that the loud bang heard on the plane was likely the tail of the plane striking a mountain, causing a fire in the plane and causing everybody on the plane besides him and the stewardess he was talking to pass away. Although that's something we'll discuss more later. But in case a train crash or a plane crash weren't enough, don't worry, because there's more. In 1966, Frayne was riding a bus from Yugoslavia to Croatia when the bus skidded off the road into the river, once again drowning passengers and leaving Frayne injured, although alive. And following these now train, plane, and bus accidents, Frayne also allegedly was involved in 3 separate car accidents where he defied death every single time. The first car accident alleged by Frayne involves his car catching fire as he was driving it, nearly killing him in the process. And then a year later, he had another incident with his car catching fire, although this time the fire wasn't in the engine bay, the fire was being blown directly at him through the air vents, singeing his hair, although he was able to get out of the car in time before it exploded. And then years after that, Frayne alleges that he was driving on a canyon road when a United Nations military truck improperly took a curve on this steep mountain road, causing Frayne to swerve into a guardrail, causing his car to fly off of a cliff. However, because Frayne was not wearing a seatbelt, he was able to jump out of his car and land in a tree before his car made a 300-foot plummet to the bottom of the canyon and exploded. Now, after surviving all of these death-defying situations, it would be reasonable to say that this guy has likely won the lottery multiple times over. Although in 2002, that metaphor would also become reality, because during that year, Frayne bought a lottery ticket and ended up winning over $1 million equivalent. It was after this notable lottery winning when the story of Frayne Selleck kind of became publicly known, because after this lottery winning, he began doing public interviews, and the stories that he was telling was simply too much to deny. And he began to do more and more interviews, and these stories began to go viral. So viral, in fact, that in 2004, Frayne even starred in a Doritos commercial. And it's even alleged that during the drive home from this Doritos commercial, he hit a deer in his car, which is unfortunate and also dangerous. Now, if you've been paying extra attention, you would have noticed that I've been putting extra emphasis on the fact that all of these stories are either alleged or reported by Frayne and not, well, proven. Almost all of the death-defying stories we know about Frayne became widely known decades after they happened. And out of all of these now famous stories, none of them have been independently verified. And there has also been contradictions found within different tellings of these stories by Frayne, meaning that there may be a bit of fiction mixed in with the facts. Although I did want to tell this story because of how insane it is and how, well, popular it's kind of became. Regardless if you believe Frayne or not, or you believe he was punching up his stories or making up complete fairy tales, the reality is Frayne is famously known as one of the most lucky, unlucky men to ever live. And whether or not his stories actually happened or even kind of happened, we may never know. Frayne passed away at the age of 87 in 2016. And today, we are still telling the stories that he told. Fact or fiction, Frayne, the humble music teacher from Croatia, turned himself from man to legend. Ron Hunt. It is August 2003, and Ron Hunt is a 41-year-old construction worker working in California. He is your average run-of-the-mill blue-collar man. He likes truck, beer, boob, and he certainly doesn't mind getting an eyeful of either of those things. However, on this fateful day, Ron was about to get an eyeful of something he did not bargain for. This day on the job site started like any other, briefing with the other contractors and then getting right to work. Shortly after starting his shift, Ron was tasked drilling a hole in cement roughly 5 to 10 feet off of the ground. This task was nothing new to Ron, and he grabbed the appropriate tools. He grabbed an impact drill with an 18-inch chip auger drill bit and a 6-foot ladder. Approaching the wall on the job site that required the hole, Ron carefully set up the ladder, ensured that it was sturdy, and then began to climb the ladder and then, of course, drill. However, almost instantly after beginning to drill this hole, Ron could tell that something was not right. The 18-inch drill bit was struggling to make any progress into the concrete, and while Ron was trying to use leverage to force it into the guide hole, he noticed that the ladder was not as sturdy as he once thought. Although, almost immediately after noticing that the ladder was not extremely stable, his footing gave way from right below him, and he lost his balance and fell forward. This situation is terrifying. However, for Ron, this is something that he was trained for. And as a construction worker with decades of experience, he knew that when you're working at heights, if you are falling, you should throw your tool as far away as you can. And that he did. Although, unfortunately, Ron did not throw the drill far enough. And instead of having the drill land feet away from him, the drill landed drill side up on the ground directly below Ron. And Ron fell directly onto the drill. having the drill bit penetrate through his right eye through the back of his skull. An injury that undoubtedly would kill 99.9% of people that it would happen to. Although for Ron, this extremely unlucky situation would actually turn out to be the luckiest situation of his life. Immediately following the fall, Ron's coworkers ran to his side. And while the scene was absolutely gruesome, they remained calm and called for help immediately. While waiting for help, Ron was not only shockingly alive, but conscious, and was able to feel around his head to try to understand how severe the injury was. And when he felt the entry point of the drill on his eye and the exit point on the back of his head, he knew he was in serious trouble. Although he didn't let that situation get the better of him. Due to Ron's coworkers' quick response, the paramedics arrived only minutes after the accident happened. And after examining Ron, a helicopter arrived to airlift him to a medical center in Reno, Nevada. Interestingly, it has been reported, not by Ron, but by actual doctors and nurses, that during his time in the hospital while he was being examined by professionals, Ron was not only conscious and talking, but also lighthearted and cracking jokes. Meaning that even in his most dire times, he was able to keep a light heart, which to me is just so cool and honestly respectable. However, even though Ron was able to laugh and joke, the situation was still extremely life-threatening and difficult, considering that in most instances, this injury would be instant death. Therefore, this has not been an injury that has been often treated, meaning that the medical professionals not only had to think fast, but leave no room for error. Because while Ron was alive now, there was so many opportunities for them to accidentally kill him while trying to remove the drill bit. While the doctors and nurses were examining Ron, they were able to discover why this injury didn't kill him. And that's because the path that this drill bit took through Ron's skull was almost the perfect trajectory to not puncture the brain whatsoever. Looking at an x-ray, they were able to see that the drill bit literally pushed the brain out of the way rather than penetrating through it, which is why Ron not only survived, but also had no neurological issues. He wasn't paralyzed, he wasn't lacking motor skills or speech function, he was all there, just with a giant metal spike in his head. Interestingly, one of the first treatments that Ron received was a tetanus shot and an IV full of antibiotics. And this is because there was a massive non-sterile foreign object that not only caused, but also resided within multiple lacerations to the head, holes in the skull, and was also currently in contact with the brain raw. And because of this, there was an overwhelming opportunity for infection to take place either in the skull, the brain, or either of the skin lacerations. Meaning that even if they were able to successfully remove this drill, there was still a significant chance of infection taking Ron's life. After receiving this first dose of antibiotics, he was sent to the operating room, where the removal procedure began. And while it may seem like one of the most counterintuitive and dangerous methods, the way that the doctors decided to remove the drill bit was by using the same way that it got in. That's right. In the operating room, they put Ron on a ladder and made him fall on the ground so that the floor would push the drill bit out. That's a lie. I'm totally joking. What they actually did in the operating room was slowly and carefully screw the drill bit in reverse so that it would easily make its way out. And the reason they were able to do this was because there was no brain tissue entrapped in the drill. Because it wasn't penetrated, it was simply pushed to the side. And once the drill was fully removed from the skull, the doctors were then able to begin a massive cleanup job, making sure that this huge wound was not and did not get infected. They removed dirt, debris, bone fragments, and dead tissue, which unfortunately included his right eye. Although after the surgery and the following surgery to fix some of the fractures in his skull, Ron spent a few weeks in hospital being monitored to ensure that no infections would grow, and once doctors were satisfied that his condition was stable, he was released to go home and went on to live a normal life, and actually became known as the Miracle Man because of how lucky and unlucky this man was. After everything was said and done, the only lasting impacts that Ron had due to this event were the fact that he was blind in the right eye because he didn't have a right eye, and nerve damage to one of the nerves on the right side of his face, meaning that the right side of his face was essentially paralyzed. But beyond those two effects specifically, Ron made a full recovery, and still to this day lives a normal life. And while it definitely feels a bit odd to call somebody lucky for losing an eye and having facial nerve damage, when you understand the context of the situation, it's easy to see how lucky and unlucky Ron truly was. Unlucky, obviously, because of the accident that took place, but lucky because he literally survived the impossible, and potentially the world's most severe lobotomy we've ever seen. Roger Woodward. It was a warm July day in 1960, and a New York father decided it was the perfect day to take his two children on a boat ride. The location that this father decided to take his children on the boat ride was an area of water in New York known as the Upper Niagara River, the river that leads directly to Niagara Falls, the iconic waterfall on the border of the United States and Canada. This was a boat ride that this man had done numerous times before. Although, on this boat ride, things would not go so smoothly. As reported by Roger Woodward himself, decades after the event took place, his recollection of events are as follows. Roger, the son, his sister, and his father were all enjoying the relatively standard boat ride when Roger asked his father if he could steer the boat for a little while. His father agreed and allowed him to sit on his lap on the seat. Although almost instantly after joining his father at the wheel, the waters began to get dangerously rough and the boat began to develop motor trouble, leaving the boat essentially stranded in dangerous water. Realizing that the situation was dire, Roger's father removed Roger from his lap and tried to take control of the boat, although his efforts were unsuccessful, and the boat actually ended up capsizing in the river due to the severity of the waters they were in. When the boat capsized, all 3 of the family members were tossed into the water, and each one of them had a different experience. Roger's sister, who was 17 at the time, was shockingly saved and pulled out of the water only 6 meters of the edge of the falls. Although for her brother, Roger, and her dad, they were not so lucky to be saved. And both Roger Woodward and his father went over the Canadian Horseshoe Falls. Now, if you know anything about Niagara Falls, there has been numerous people who have gone over the falls, many of which who have not survived. It's actually been estimated that since 1850, there have been at least 5,000 people who have gone over the falls. And it's also estimated that there are 20 to 30 deaths that occur annually at Niagara Falls, although mostly due to personal intention, if you understand what I'm saying. Now, out of those thousands of people that have gone over the falls, it is reported that only 16 to 20 have been confirmed to survive the extremely deadly and dangerous Niagara Falls. Now, I mentioned this to give context about exactly how deadly and rare it is to even survive. Just doing some quick math based on the estimates, that's literally a 0.05% chance of surviving. Back to the story, however. Unfortunately, both Roger and his father were swept up in the rapids and sent down Niagara Falls. Roger's father, unfortunately and unsurprisingly, perished in the falls. But somehow, miraculously, Roger Woodward survived being sent down Niagara Falls at the age of only 7 years old. After being sent down the waterfall, surviving the immense pressure of the water, nearly missing all of the jagged and deadly rocks at the bottom of the falls, and not drowning, Roger was actually spotted by tourists on the Maid of the Mist boat. It's a little boat that goes to the bottom of Niagara Falls, and the crew quickly made a beeline over to the boy as they saw his bright orange life jacket, likely the item that saved this boy's life. After the captain put the boat directly beside Roger, his crew threw a life preserver and they were able to successfully bring him on board merely minutes after spotting him. Roger was immediately sent to the Niagara General Hospital, where he stayed for only 3 days with a minor concussion and bruises. There has been numerous daredevils who have tried to make safe and insulated barrels to go over the falls in, and over half of them have died. Although this 7-year-old boy who was simply trying to have a good time with his family went over the falls, survived, and lived to tell the tale. And he has since this event visited Niagara Falls often into his adulthood. Roger was undoubtedly extremely lucky in this extremely unlucky situation, and he has gone on record saying that he is extremely grateful to be alive. Speaking of lucky situations, I would say it's pretty lucky that you found this channel. Realistically, there are millions of YouTube channels, and you could be watching anything right now. So the fact that you found my channel, to me, is super lucky, and I hope that you're enjoying this video. Now, I've never really made a video on this topic before, so I just wanted to say if you guys would love to see a part 2 about people that survived the impossible, the luckiest, unlucky people, leave a like or leave a comment below saying part 2 so that I know you guys want more of this topic. If you're new here and haven't subscribed yet, please consider doing so, because we make cool videos every single Friday. But with that being said, let's get to the final entry of this list. Bill Morgan. The year is 1998, and Bill Morgan is a 37-year-old truck driver living in a camper van. Not a lot is known publicly about the early life of Bill Morgan, but knowing that he was born and raised in Australia, we can assume that he grew up playing with spiders and fighting kangaroos. Regardless, from his birth to the age of 37, it's believed that Bill lived the life of the average Australian man, doing honest work and traveling the country he loved in his camper van. A simple and respectable life. Although, everything was about to change on one fateful day. During what appeared to be a relatively normal drive in his camper van, Bill was struck and nearly killed in a car crash that seemingly happened in the blink of an eye. Fortunately, Bill was able to survive this car accident, although not by much. And while he was recovering in the hospital, it was discovered that due to this car accident, he actually developed a heart condition. Now, while most of us would consider a heart condition a better trade-off than death in this situation, this heart condition was still not ideal. And what doctors recommended to Bill was that he take a certain medication to help relieve his symptoms and protect his heart. Although when Bill started taking this medication, he suffered a severe allergic reaction that once again nearly killed him by ironically triggering a heart attack. After experiencing this cardiac event due to this medication, Bill was declared clinically dead for 14.5 minutes. Although he was miraculously revived by paramedics and was then sent to the hospital where he spent 12 days in a coma. And during this time, things were not looking good. And doctors were actually advocating to Bill's family that they should potentially consider end-of-life planning and, well, pulling the plug. And while that sounds absolutely unfair and devastating and cruel, the reality is it wasn't necessarily bad advice from a professional perspective. And that's because previously, as we know, Bill was clinically dead for 14.5 minutes, which statistically speaking means that even if he were to recover from the coma, he would be in a severe, likely vegetative state due to the cognitive decline his brain would have experienced without having oxygen for such an amount of time. For context, brain damage begins to occur at only 4 minutes without oxygen. So the fact that he was dead for over 14 minutes paints a pretty severe picture. However, because Bill had already been so lucky up until this point, and his family was so determined and dedicated, they decided to do no such thing. Unfortunately, after 12 days of being in a coma, he not only woke up, but woke up and made a full recovery, having all of his mental faculties and being able to walk and talk. Something that has to be a statistic anomaly. But we're not done yet. So far, Bill has beaten death in the form of a car accident, in the form of an allergic reaction, in the form of being literally clinically dead, and in the form of a coma. Although, even though every one of those instances is an expression of bad luck, it's also an expression of good luck because he, well, survived them seemingly unscathed. Although, unbelievably, he didn't use up all of his luck on all of these near-death experiences. And that's because in the year following the car crash and coma, Bill not only bought a lottery scratcher ticket, something he did weekly, but he also won. And he didn't win $5 or $10, he won a Toyota Corolla that was worth anywhere from 17 to 30,000 Australian dollars. And this is where the story gets really quite interesting, because similar to Frayn's story at the beginning of this video, after this lottery winning, Bill's story became publicly televised, and it was spreading rapidly and so interesting because of how much misfortune he experienced, only to then go on and not only survive, but win the lottery. And because his story was so interesting, the news wanted to do a segment about Bill. While filming the segment, the news anchor asked Bill if he minded buying a lottery ticket so they could reenact the scene where he won the car. And since scratching lottery tickets was a pastime of Bill's, he had no issue doing such. Although, to the surprise of everybody, when Bill went ahead and bought and scratched off the lottery ticket simply to just get some B-roll for the news, he was shocked at what he had found. While the cameras were rolling and Bill was simply silently scratching off a ticket, Bill suddenly froze and the energy in the room paused. Bill turned around, looked directly at the camera, and quietly said, "I just won $250,000. I'm not joking. I just won $250,000. And then immediately after realizing what he had just said and won, he put his hands over his head and said, "Please don't film me. I don't believe this is happening. I think I will have another heart attack." Bill was obviously shocked about what had just happened, likely more shocked than us. And once the reality set in a bit more and he knew he wasn't having a heart attack, he quickly called his fiancée, told her that they could buy a new house, and she even later went on to tell the news, quote, "I hope he hadn't used up all of his good luck." And one of my favorite parts about the story is that this is verifiable, and the footage of this happening is literally on YouTube right now. I'm going to play a short clip of it, but it is just so wholesome to see this man's genuine reaction to finally catching a break after nearly losing his life multiple times, realistically due to no fault of his own. I don't know about you, but I find that video so wholesome, and I just love when genuine, real people get what they deserve. In a good way. In my opinion, Bill is a legend. And while all of this happened back in 1998 and 1999, as of 2020, Bill still lives in Melbourne with his wife. And while he does still suffer with heart issues and arthritis because of the car accident, he is grateful for his life, even stating, quote, "I've had a bonus of 22 years. Oh wait, I guess I should maybe say this Australian. I've had okay, that's not Australian. I've had okay, let me try it one more time. Like, I'm trying my hardest. Yeah, I've had a bonus of 22 years. Okay, like, I'm gonna try it, but okay, let's just try it. I've had a bonus of 22 years, and that's the, wait, again. I've had a bonus of 22 years, and that's the best way to live your life. Every day I get up and put on my shoes, and even if I'm not real well, I still shuffle down the road and smell the roses. Look at the sun and think about how lucky I am." That was potentially the worst accent you've ever heard, but it's also a true expression of gratitude, which for me makes Bill that much more of a legend. And it's even reported that to this very day, Bill is still buying lottery tickets every single week. And who knows? Maybe soon there'll be an update to this video where Bill won the lottery once again. But even if he never does, I would say he is very much so a lucky man who beat some pretty unlucky situations. Survival myths that would actually get you killed. Once again, you and your best bro are bored out of your minds on the couch. The last time you guys were this bored, you guys ended up watching Bear Grylls so much that you got inspired to try to be like him. And because of the insane misadventures that you and your friend already went on, you decided that you are never going to be putting yourself in survival situations again. However, as you guys are watching TV, you notice a commercial for a cruise. And this inspires you and your best bro, because going on a cruise seems like the perfect way to experience nature while also remaining safe and away from any sort of survival situations. You and your bro pack your bags and head on your way to your next vacation. As you guys make it to the port, you enter the boat only to realize that the people on the boat are handing out pamphlets. You grab one of these pamphlets and realize that what they're handing out isn't a pamphlet at all. It's actually a book on totally real survival tips. And while you kind of brush this off as standard safety protocol in case anything bad happens, you definitely find it a bit ironic. And now your totally safe vacation has begun. While unpacking, your bro has already gotten into the alcohol in the room and is now way too intoxicated for 11 a.m. You try to ignore his drunken ramblings while you unpack until you realize that he's opening the door to the balcony and it looks like he's not stopping. Your friend was only trying to get a peek at the view when he actually falls overboard into the water. Instantly, this puts your friend into the first survival situation of this video. With your friend overboard and you looking down at him, you quickly run to that survival book that you were given and read to him what you should do if you fall overboard. As your friend looks smaller and smaller in the water as the cruise ship drifts away, you yell to your friend that if he wants to live, he has to swim as hard as possible to try to catch up to the boat. Your friend tries to swim as quickly as possible to catch up to the boat and uses almost all of his energy. And while this may seem logical to try to swim to the closest safety if you are abandoned at sea, this is actually the first myth of this video. In this specific situation, when you're in the middle of the water and fall off a cruise ship, the last thing you want to do is try to overexert yourself. Cruise ships move way faster than any human can swim. And even if you know that you can't catch up to it and you're just trying to, be as close as possible, you are still putting yourself at a massive risk. And the simple reason is, in this situation, this energy that you are exerting is going to make you lose body temperature and also lose stamina quickly. Two things that will only speed up your death in the water. What you actually want to do in this situation is to remain calm and begin to float, trying to move as little as possible while also trying to make yourself as visible as possible. The main reason why you want to float is so you can conserve as much energy as possible. Because in the ocean, your body is already going to be working double time just to try to maintain its body temperature. And the reason why you want to be as visible as possible is because the only way that you're getting saved in this situation is either by a rescue boat or by a rescue helicopter. And fortunately for your bro, a rescue helicopter was not only able to spot him, but was able to drop a ladder and pick him up, flying him back to the cruise ship on the helipad. Now, you meet your bro on the helipad and decide that you are already done with this cruise, and you decide that it's time to get off this cruise ship and to get out of here entirely. You actually board the helicopter with your bro, and you guys decide to fly back home. Although, it's on that helicopter ride from the cruise ship back home that you guys end up on another adventure. As this helicopter flies over an extremely remote area, a storm appears seemingly out of nowhere. Lightning strikes the helicopter and you all go down. You and your bro wake up in a daze and realize that the pilot is gone, the helicopter is useless, and you two are once again, unintentionally, in a survival situation. And your sole goal is to survive and get home with only the shirts on your back and the information in this book that has already proven to be not so helpful. Being stranded once again, you and your bro decide to take a different approach than you did in the first adventure. The last time you guys tried to survive in the wilderness, you instantly tried to find your way out. But today, you decide that your best course of action is to set up camp exactly where you are. Because if your best chance of surviving at sea is to wait to be found, you figured you should probably do the same thing when you're lost in the forest as well. And for that reason, you and your bro instantly start to build shelters. Obviously, neither of you are formally trained in bushcraft architecture. However, you've seen those videos at 2 a.m. with the guys building crazy water slides and whatnot, so you had a good idea. You decided to refer to this pamphlet from the cruise ship to see if it had any wisdom about this, and it actually did. It said that you can complete survival projects at a normal pace in a survival situation. And it was that information that gave you and your buddy confidence to go all out. Instead of initially building a fire or looking for food, you and your friend decide that the best course of action is to chop trees and build a 2-story house with a water slide. Those guys on YouTube do it in a day. We can do that too. However, after nearly 12 hours of collecting resources and trying to build, you and your bro have nearly no progress. You have a pile of logs, 2 stakes in the ground, ground, and you and your friend are exhausted with basically nothing to show for it. And this leads to our second survival myth. The myth being that you can complete survival projects at a normal pace. Here's the thing. Those guys in the YouTube video, first of all, many of them are using actual machinery off screen, but even the ones that are doing it for real are not in genuine survival situations. They have access to food and water and shelter at their leisure, meaning that they can actually work at a regular pace. However, in a survival situation, any project is going to take much longer. And the reason for this isn't because you just are lacking the tools, it's actually because your energy expenditure and your time management are critical for your survival. Just look at you and your friend right now. Even though you guys spent the entire day grinding, you have nothing to show for it, you have empty bellies, you have no fire and no shelter. You guys are weak, exhausted, and dehydrated. And because you underestimated the effort that goes into surviving in the wilderness, you are now on the verge of death. What you should have done when establishing a camp is first and foremost establishing a fire, using this wood to build a fire that you could consistently add to provide both warmth and light. And this light specifically would be crucial for being found. And then, once your fire is established, you want to put all of your effort and energy into finding food. Bugs, small animals, plants, whatever it may be, you need to find a lot of food. Edible food in a survival situation is hard to come by, and even what you do come by is typically not plentiful, meaning that a lot of your energy and time is going to go directly into trying to replenish your energy with more food. And with all of the time and effort required to simply feed yourself and sustain your own life, you're going to have little to no time to sustain your fire or to build these crazy projects as well. Fortunately for you and your bro, your plot armor is stronger than ever. And even though you two are both feeling incredibly weak after spending an entire day doing almost nothing, one of the luckiest things that could happen happens. Lightning just so happens to strike that big pile of wood you collected, starting you the perfect fire. But not only do you now have a fire, which is already a blessing, you notice a wild blind chicken walking directly into your fire. You and your friend just went from making a fatal mistake to now essentially being the winners of the lottery. And with a fire to warm you through the night and food to sustain you through the night, you both decide to get some sleep and continue your adventure in the morning. You wake up the following morning, your fire is out, your food is gone, and you decide to learn from the mistakes of last night. You realize that the most important thing you can do right now is look for food. And while you are already feeling nervous about how you are going to find more food, your friend opens the survival book and reads, "You can survive solely off survival foods." And with this information, he seems confident that he can sustain you guys off of random plants. And following his lead, you guys begin to forage. You both begin to gather things like tree bark, lily pad tubes, hemlock needles, and snails. And after hours of foraging, you come back to your base camp to find a pretty disappointing meal. And after eating everything you collected, you realize that you actually spent more calories trying to find this meal than this entire meal gave you. Meaning that you would have been better off not looking for any of this stuff in the first place. Which is why this is actually another survival myth. Survival foods are exactly as they sound. They're meant for survival situations, although they cannot sustain you long term. It's important to understand what you can and can't eat in the wilderness. However, it's also important to consider the context that these survival foods are not and cannot be your main source of nourishment. And while they're better than nothing, eating these foods are typically only a band-aid solution until you're able to find some sort of actual sustenance, either from fishing or trapping an animal. At this point, you and your bro are becoming very suspicious of this survival book from the cruise ship, because so far, nothing's been right. Although it's your only source of survival information, and for that reason, you have no choice but to follow it. You and your bro give up on finding any more food for now, and instead switch your focus because at this point, it's been days since you and your bro had water. And the human body can go a lot longer without food than it can water, and you are already beginning to feel the effects of dehydration. Interestingly, when you discuss being dehydrated with your friend, he disagrees with you, and he says that, "I don't feel super thirsty right now, so I don't think I need water." And while you know that you definitely need water because it's been so long, you realize that you don't actually feel particularly thirsty either, but you know you don't feel right, which is why for this reason you decide to consult the book. And this book, in its infinite wisdom, literally says, unless you are feeling extremely thirsty, you are in no way dehydrated. And with this information, your friend reassures you that you do not need to find water now, and your friend even tells you that on your pursuit of finding civilization, you'll probably find water anyway, even though we don't need it right now, because we're not thirsty. With no proof to counter his claim, you follow his lead once again, and you guys continue on your pursuit. However, only after a few hours of walking, you notice that both you and your friend start to feel dizzy, and really quite tired. Your friend stops at a tree to take a leak, and you happen to notice that his urine is literally brown. Now, in the least sus way possible, you try to bring this to his attention, and all you get back is some slurred ramblings about how it doesn't matter and you're being weird. And before you know it, your friend passes out directly in front of your face. And only moments later, you notice your vision start to turn black as well, and you, also hit the floor. You and your friend are both laying down on your backs with your mouths wide open, and you've once again fallen victim to another survival myth. You don't need to be extremely thirsty to be dehydrated. And because you and your friend directly ignored the early warning signs of dehydration, it led to you both reaching a point of no return. The truth of the matter is this. People typically assume that dehydration only begins once you start to feel very thirsty, but that's actually the opposite of the truth. Thirst and extreme thirst are typically a late-stage warning sign of dehydration, and the early-stage signs are typically very subtle. These signs include a dry mouth, darker than usual urine, a headache, fatigue, irritability, dizziness. And I think in our day-to-day lives, we're all pretty good at managing our hydration and noticing when we're dehydrated before feeling thirsty. However, in a survival situation, cues that you may be dehydrated can typically be disregarded as either stress or hunger or tiredness, and for that reason, you can forget to drink until it's too late. Fortunately for you and your friend, passed out in near death on the ground, a torrential downpour just happens to happen right above you. And this downpour fills both of your mouths with water, and you both instinctually swallow it, hydrating yourselves and saving yourselves once again. However, you now may be hydrated, but you are cold and wet. And while that rain was nice, you do need a consistent source of water if you want to continue to live. And for that reason, you don't listen to your friend and you say, "We are looking for water, and we're going to look now." Although, that brings you to your next issue. How do you find water in the middle of the forest? Reluctantly, you know that your only option is to refer to the book. And while your confidence is low, you read the next survival tip. And it says, follow birds to find water. There are many survival myths claiming that if you follow a bird, eventually it will lead you to water. Right after you finish telling your friend how you guys are going to find water, you notice a group of geese flying above. And this looked like your ticket to hydration, because not only were geese birds, but geese are also known to fly towards water. And for that reason, you and your friend quickly sprint to follow these geese to see wherever they may go. After running through the woods for what feels like hours, you notice that you have come out of the woods and into a large clearing. And luckily, you notice these geese descending, and you begin to get excited that you have now found water. However, as these geese land and you approach these geese, you realize that the geese weren't heading towards water at all. They were only heading to an opening to take an afternoon nap. And once again, you and your friend have fallen for a survival myth. The idea that you can follow birds to find water is not completely false, but it is unreliable. For example, it is true that some aquatic birds stay close to water and typically can lead you to water eventually. It's also true that they can travel long distances away from water to find food or shelter. And in the example of the geese that you just followed, it's just as likely that you could follow these geese to a body of water as it is you could follow them to an open field where they plan on sleeping for the night. The reality is that you can't predict where a bird is going, and following it is a gamble and likely a waste of time. And if you do find yourself in a survival situation and happen to see an aquatic bird, I would definitely take that as a sign that you're close to water. However, I wouldn't necessarily follow it, as it could put you into more danger than you were originally in. Now, with you and your friend bamboozled in the middle of a field, you decide that your only option is to continue forward. And as you traverse forward, you notice that the grass turns into sand, and you go from the plains biome to the desert biome, and things are about to get complicated. Most notably, your need for water has just gone up exponentially. Feeling desperate, you decide to consult the book. When your friend slaps the book out of your hand and tells you, "Okay, enough with this book, it has never been right. I have an idea." I remember watching that survival TV show, and the guy built a solar still. All we need to do is dig a hole in the ground, put some plastic over top, and we will have an infinite water source. When your friend said this, you were kind of shocked and almost thought you were hallucinating, because for the first time ever, your friend said something that was actually logical and somewhat smart, and you confidently follow his lead. It is until you run into your first issue. To build a solar still, you need some sort of plastic to catch the water. You ask your friend if he had any plastic whatsoever, and he, somewhat embarrassingly, pulls out his wallet, and from his wallet, pulls out a condom. You don't probe your friend on what he planned on using this condom for. However, from this point on, your guard is up a little extra, but you decide to focus back on the solar still. You and your friend dig the hole, put the plastic over top of the hole, put a rock in the center, and wait for moisture to be drawn out of the ground through the hot desert sun, and have it collect and drip into the small makeshift bowl at the bottom of the pit you made with leaves. Building the solar still took roughly a few hours, and you two were sweating incredibly in the hot sun making this. After the few hours you spent making it, you wait another hour to see exactly what this solar still is able to produce. When you realize that after an hour, you're only able to get a few milliliters, and you realize that the solar still was a net negative, because not only is it going to yield you not nearly enough water to survive, but once again, you exerted more energy and hydration creating the solar still than it could ever replenish, meaning that you once again fell well for a survival myth. This one's a bit interesting because solar stills definitely do have a very practical and realistic application in certain scenarios. However, in this scenario of being in the desert, it is an extremely impractical way of getting water. And this is because the amount of water you can get from a solar still really depends on a few factors, specifically ground moisture, temperature, and climate, and the size of the still. If you're trying to draw water out of a dry desert, you can basically guarantee that you will get little to no water in a meaningful amount of time. However, if you were in a place that was reasonably moist, or potentially in a place that had water that just wasn't usable, let's say salt water, then you could definitely use a still to purify water that was otherwise unclean. However, when you're in the desert, there is no water to purify, and the water you can draw out of the ground is minimal, meaning that you have to abandon the still and continue looking elsewhere for water. Going behind your friend's back to see if the book had any other wisdom on finding water, you read that the book says that you can drink water from any cactus in the desert. And luckily for you, you were in the desert and there was plenty of cactus around. And without disclosing that you got this information from the book, you tell your friend that you have an idea. We can go drink water from these cactuses. Let's go. So you and your friend both approach a cactus, you carefully rip off one of the arms, and you begin to drink the goo that's dripping out of it. Almost instantly, your friend begins to vomit, and you start spewing from the other end. And unfortunately, you are once again the victim of a deadly survival myth. It is totally true that there are cacti out there that contain drinkable water that can actually hydrate you safely. However, unlike the movies make it out to seem, you cannot do this for every cactus. Most species of cactus don't contain drinkable water whatsoever. And what they actually contain is a bitter, slimy liquid filled with alkaloids and other compounds that can make you sick and actually dehydrate you further. And unfortunately, this was a lesson you and your friend had to learn the hard way. As you pull up your pants after the anal exorcism you just had from the cactus water, you look at your friend to notice something terrifying. Your friend, wiping his mouth from the gross cactus puke, looks at you confused, wondering what you're staring at. When you look at his forehead and see that when he puked, he impaled his head with a massive cactus spike. You ask your friend if he feels anything and if he is in any pain. And he says no, after he puked, he actually feels a lot better. However, he's still pretty thirsty. But he doesn't say anything about the massive cactus spike simply sticking out of his skull. Your friend seems concerned because he can tell you're freaking out about something, but you won't tell him what's going on. Instead, you open the book and see if it has any wisdom about what to do when you've been impaled. And of course, the book has a survival tip for you. The book claims that if anybody is impaled by something, the best thing to do is immediately remove it. And to you, this initially makes sense, because if there is a foreign object in your body, obviously you don't want it there. And if you can remove it, you should. And so because of this, you simply tell your friend to sit down, tell him to relax, and say that there's something on his head that you're gonna just quickly remove. With your friend sitting down, you tell him to close his eyes, and you grab the massive spike and rip it out of his head. As soon as you rip the spike out of his head, you realize that the spike was actually holding in a flash flood of blood. So you quickly re-impale your friend in the head with this spike and act like nothing happened at all. At this point, your friend opens his eyes, sees the blood, and demands to know what's going on. And you tell him the truth. And surprisingly, he actually has a pretty insightful response, and he tells you that no, the book was wrong again. If you become stabbed or impaled by an object, one of the worst things you can do is instantly try to remove it. Depending on where you're stabbed, pulling out the object could cause massive bleeding, disrupt any of the clotting that has potentially begun, and it can also worsen the damage by pulling out the object incorrectly, or if the object is barbed. The best thing that you can actually do in this situation is try to stabilize the object to ensure it doesn't move at all. It sounds counterintuitive, but you actually want to maintain this object stabbed in you at the same depth, at the same pressure, until you can get medical attention. And that's exactly what you do. In shock of how insightful your friend was, out of nowhere once again, you notice that your friend firmly holds the base of the spike and breaks off the rest. After this, your friend takes one of his socks, wraps it around his head to ensure that the spike doesn't go anywhere, and from this point, you guys continue to keep moving. As you both walk through the desert, the sun begins to set, and you happen to stumble upon a cave and decide that this was the perfect place to spend the night. Hungry, dehydrated, and exhausted, you and your friend sit there, finally relaxing for the first time in what feels like days. And while you and your friend look a lot worse for wear, you're at least happy to be alive. And it's within this small moment of gratitude that you notice that your friend not only has a bloody sock wrapped around his head, but he's also developing a bloody nose. At this point, this is very concerning because with how dehydrated you and your friend are, any loss of moisture could be deadly. And with how much blood your friend has already lost up until this point, you guys are really not in a position to lose any more. Your friend begins to get very lightheaded, and for that reason, you decide to help him with his bloody nose. And fortunately, for this situation, you don't need to consult the book because everybody knows how to deal with a bloody nose. Obviously, what you want to do is tip your head back to stop the bleeding. And you do exactly that. Your friend is sitting, you stand behind him, and you tilt his head backwards, and you notice that he's now coughing up the blood that was coming out of his nose, meaning that the bleeding was not stopping whatsoever. It was just being misdirected. Because of this, you decide to let him go, and because he is so tired, he happens tends to just lean forward. And due to this forward lean, his nosebleed actually stops relatively quickly, turning a survival myth into an unintentional survival truth. Here's what I mean. I don't know about you, but I remember growing up, every time I had a nosebleed, people told you to hold the bridge of your nose and tilt your head back. And while this is a common tip that has been passed down through generations, it's actually been heavily debated and at this point in time is kind of been debunked basically fully. It's been shown time and time again that tilting your head backwards is actually unsafe and can make the situation worse, as we saw with your friend. When you tilt your head backwards, the blood doesn't stop, it simply flows down your throat, which could directly cause you to swallow blood, leading to nausea or vomiting, or potentially even choking in severe cases, which is why what you actually want to do is basically the opposite. If you get a nosebleed, according to the Red Cross, the most effective way to end it safely is to sit upright or even lean slightly forward, because leaning slightly forward can help reduce the blood pressure in the veins in your nose, which would help slow the bleeding, while also ensuring that the blood drains out of your nose instead of down your throat and potentially into your stomach or lungs. Once seated in this position, you do actually want to grab the soft part of your nose right below your bridge, and then simply wait 10 to 15 minutes while maintaining a consistent pressure and this consistent position until the blood flow stops. And it's really as simple as that. And it's kind of interesting how the fact is so close yet so far from the fiction, and most people, at least in my experience, always tilt their head back, when in reality, going the opposite direction is the most ideal way to go about it. Now, another pro-level tip you could do if you have a nosebleed, if you do have access to an ice pack or anything cold, is to put this ice pack on your nose or cheek area, allowing the cold to constrict the blood vessels around your nose, further slowing the bleeding. Or if you don't have access to cold, what you could try to do is just take deep, slow breaths to help the clotting form faster. But speaking of clotting, one thing you definitely don't want to do is shove stuff up your nose. Even if you think that shoving something up your nose will help stop the bleeding, or if the bleeding stopped and you're just shoving something up there to prevent further bleeding, the reality in most cases is if you shove something up your nose while it's bleeding, you're only going to irritate the area more and very likely dislodge clotting, which basically restarts the entire healing process again. Unfortunately for your friend, you didn't have anything to shove up his nose, because if you did, you would have, and it would have only hurt him more. And with you and your bros blood-fueled fiasco over, you try to get some sleep because you know tomorrow's not going to be easy. You close your eyes and fall asleep in the cave and wake up to the feeling of something scratching you. You think your friend might be just poking your arm, and you open your eyes to realize that there are multiple tarantulas all over your body. Instantly, you book it out of the cave, throwing these tarantulas on the ground and stomping on them. With you and your friend now more awake than any coffee could get you, you decide it's time to continue your journey as you hope that you can find some civilization soon. Because unlike the first adventure that you and your bro took, this adventure was not planned, and you have no survival supplies on you. And if you're not able to find civilization soon, you guys are surely done for. As you both walk through the desert seemingly aimlessly, with vultures flying not too far behind you, almost foreshadowing your soon demise, your friend notices something in the distance. He begins to jump around and seem extremely enthusiastic, and you ask him, What do you see? And he tells you, look up there, there's a stream, there's a river, that's water. We can drink the water and we can also follow the stream to civilization. You are not nearly as enthusiastic as your friend because you know that your friend is simply hallucinating or seeing a mirage. There's no water anywhere near you guys, and you're very likely going to die in the next few hours. Your friend seems unwavering that there is in fact a stream above, and with you having nowhere better to go, you decide to follow him. And to your shock, he was right. There was a stream of water going directly through this desert, and you both were able to finally drink as much water as your heart desired. After you two felt sufficiently hydrated, you ask your friend, wait, what did you say back there about water leading to civilization? And he tells you that, yeah, everybody knows if you get lost, just follow water downstream and it is guaranteed to lead to some sort of civilization. And while he didn't have any sort of evidence to back up this claim, you really had nowhere else to go. So, wanting to stay close to your only source of water, you and your friend begin to follow this water downstream in the hopes of finding some sort of civilization. As you both follow the stream, you fortunately find yourselves out of the desert and back into the woods. However, these woods don't last long, and you find yourselves in a climate that's getting colder and colder. You think to yourself, what kind of Minecraft terrain generation is this? But you continue forward, and eventually this water you're following downstream leads to an ocean. And this is both good news and bad news. The good news, in the distance, you can actually see an island with buildings on it. You don't know where this is, but there's people there. But the bad news is, you are in an extremely cold climate now. And this island in the distance is definitely not within swimming distance, at least in your opinion. But your friend has another perspective on that. You talk to your friend and tell him that his water theory didn't work at all. It led us to an ocean. Although your friend maintains that because there was a city off in the distance, his theory was technically right. Although the truth of the matter is this: while some people believe that following water downstream will typically find you to civilization, that is not the case in most cases. Following a river downstream could take you to a city, or could take you into hazardous terrain that could put you once again in more danger. But that's basically a mini myth at this point, because you guys have so much more to worry about. Once again, focusing on the cold water in front of you in the city in the distance, your friend argues that while the city on the island is definitely far away, it's not out of swimming range. And even though the water is cold, we won't be swimming for long enough to actually catch hypothermia. And for that reason, our best bet is to swim to this island. Here's the deal. Up until this point, you followed your friend basically blindly through everything. But cold water is where you draw the line. And you tell your friend, there's absolutely no way I'm swimming through cold water to try to make it to this island. But your friend stubbornly remains firm that he's going to swim to this island whether you're coming or not. You dare your friend to try, and you watch him walk into this nearly freezing water, only for him to begin swimming quickly and then slower and slower and slower until, well, he's basically drowning and there's nothing either of you can do. Fortunately, out of sheer chance, a massive wave picks up your friend out of this cold water and brings him directly back to shore. And you are able to tell him, I told you so. And this is because this is a survival myth that you know the truth about. One of the most dangerous survival myths is that you can swim for hours in cold water before hypothermia sets in, giving you plenty of time to swim to safety if you're in cold water. However, while it may take some time for hypothermia to fully set in, it only takes seconds for cold water to put your body in a state of panic. And in some cases, as soon as you become exposed to cold water, you could be facing the immediate risk of the cold shock response, which is essentially just an involuntary gasp of air followed by rapid breathing. Now, if your face happens to go under the water at this time, or if a wave hits you in the face, you could choke on the water and potentially drown already. But even if you don't choke on water, if you're not able to get your breathing under control, you could panic and lose control within minutes and drown. But let's say if you're swimming in cold water and you're able to maintain your breath, that is only the first step, because sure, your breathing is under control, but you are still in deadly waters. You might be able to tread water for now, but with the cold water surrounding your body, you only have roughly 10 to 30 minutes if you're lucky before your muscles and nerves begin to shut down and you can no longer have proper control of them, obviously eventually leading to drowning. But let's say that you're not treading water, you're holding onto something that's floating. Your chance of survival doesn't increase significantly because depending on how much time you're spending in the water, hypothermia is the final risk you face and possibly the deadliest of them all. Once your core body temperature begins to fall, mental confusion, sluggishness, and exhaustion sets in. And even though you're not physically exerting energy, your body is working on triple overtime just to maintain the warmth it has. And you could very easily lose all strength and let go of this one thing you're holding on to. A real survival tip surrounding cold waters is something known as the 1-10-1 rule. The first one in 1-10-1 stands for how much time you have to get your breathing under control. You have roughly 1 minute to get your breathing under control after first immersion in the water before you are set into a full panic. After this first minute of deep breathing, getting your breath under control, you have 10, which represents 10 minutes of meaningful movement before your muscles begin to weaken. So with this 10 minutes, it's best that you decide which direction you want to go if anything is even close by. For example, some floating debris or potentially an island or boat if you are so lucky. And the final one in 1-10-1 means 1 hour. And that's because it typically takes 1 hour before hypothermia leads to full unconsciousness. Meaning that if you're floating in cold water, you have roughly an hour before, well, things don't look good for you at all. And while you finish explaining this to your friend as he catches his breath from nearly drowning in this freezing water, you notice something on his leg. It's a pink squishy thing that's made his leg all red. It's a jellyfish. And you quickly grab a stick, stab the jellyfish, and throw it back in the water, only to notice that your friend now has a massive jellyfish sting on his leg. While your friend may be the most lucky and unlucky person in the world at this moment, things are about to get a lot more complicated. One, because in this situation, you actually know what you need to do, although you don't know if you have the strength to do it. As you sit there pondering on what your next move is, your friend looks you in the eyes and tells you, just do it. And you know what he means. You tell him to close his eyes, you whip out your lil bro, and you begin to urinate on his leg. Fortunately, you had a lot of urine to give because of the stream that you guys had followed. Although, unfortunately, this urination on the leg was not beneficial whatsoever. And it's once again another survival myth. It is a popular belief that the venom from a jellyfish sting can be neutralized with urine. However, in most cases, once again, the urine can actually make the sting worse. Depending on how bad the sting from the jellyfish was, the urine contacting the sting zone could actually cause the stinging cells on the skin to release more venom, which would further intensify the pain and speed up tissue damage from the venom from the sting. And in most cases, the best thing you can do when somebody has been stung by a jellyfish is to rinse the area carefully with either vinegar or salt water, which both can safely deactivate the stingers, and then you want to carefully remove the tentacles with tweezers or a stick, whatever you have. Interestingly, urine isn't the only thing you should avoid putting on a jellyfish sting, as fresh water should also be avoided, because it too can cause the stingers to fire. Now, obviously, the best case scenario is to to go to the hospital immediately. But in a survival situation, you have to make do with what you have. And as you urinate on your friend's leg and his screams begin to get louder and louder, you notice another sound. A sound that sounds like cameras clicking and flashing. And then you notice an unforgettable sound, the sound of a boat horn. You look to your left and realize that the cruise ship that you're on only a few days ago is now going directly by you, and everybody on the cruise ship is taking pictures of you urinating on your friend. And while the passengers on the ship think that these are just two kinky people living off grid, the staff of the boat recognize that you two were the people that were lost in the helicopter crash. And for that reason, they send a rescue boat from the cruise ship to pick you both up and take you back to the cruise ship. Boarding the ship, you and your friend are both relieved to be alive and saved, but also stressed out because at this point, all you want to do is be home. In the first video about survival myths, you and your friend intentionally tried to go out and survive. Although this time, you and your friend were not looking for an adventure whatsoever. You guys were simply looking for a relaxing vacation. An adventure found you. And at this point in time, you're just scared that your horrible luck will continue in another episode. As the captain approaches your room to see how you guys are doing, you greet him, thank him for saving your life, and also tell him that the books that they provided on the ship were not helpful at all in survival situations. The captain takes the book out of your hand and laughs, telling you this isn't a book about survival situations. This is a parody book about everything you should not do in a survival situation. It's literally a joke. And also, if you turn the page, it tells you what you should actually do on the other side. Don't you boys know how to read? Embarrassed to tell the captain about your literacy, you just decide to laugh and tell him, oh, yeah, thanks. And as the captain is about to leave your room, he turns around and asks, wait, how did you guys even end up in the water in the first place? And with the captain being in the doorway, you decide that the best course of action is to close the door in his face and not answer that question. Because, well, you've dealt with enough punishment over the last few days.